Hey guys, tonight we drift into the dim corridors of the Soviet Union, where the air itself feels heavy with whispers. It's the winter of 1924, and somewhere inside a government building in Moscow, the body of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin lies still in state, his waxen face illuminated by flickering candles. You stand there among thousands, your breath mixing with the scent of cold iron and incense, knowing that history is about to hold its breath. Lenin's death isn't just the end of a man, it's the cracking of a foundation. You can almost hear the power vacuum echo through marble halls. The revolution that promised equality suddenly feels leaderless, fragile, and hungry for direction. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment Lenin's heart stopped beating, the question wasn't who would mourn him, it was who would claim him. Leon Trotsky, the fiery orator and commander of the Red Army, was supposed to be the natural successor. Brilliant, articulate, maybe a little too self-assured. You imagine him writing essays deep into the night, confident that intellect would win over intrigue. But politics in Stalin's Moscow was not an essay contest. It was a chess match played with real blood. Standing across the board was Joseph Jugashvili, better known as Stalin. A quiet man in public, unremarkable in stature, with a mustache that could probably smother a small mammal. He'd once been the party's general secretary, a title that sounded bureaucratic, almost boring. But here's the trick. While everyone else was writing manifestos, Stalin was building a web. He controlled party appointments, promotions, the flow of information, tiny levers that moved the entire machine. You don't need to be loud when you can choose who gets to speak. By early 1924, you could sense the unease. Lenin's final months had been poisoned, figuratively, though some still wonder if literally, by factional struggles. He dictated what became known as his testament, a sharply worded document that warned the party about Stalin's temper and suggested removing him from power. It should have been a career-ending memo. Instead, Stalin ensured it never saw daylight at the crucial party congress. Historians still argue whether Lenin truly feared Stalin's cruelty or merely distrusted his political instincts. But either way, the result was the same. The warning went unheeded. At the funeral, Stalin orchestrated one of the greatest political performances of the century. Draped in black, he stood solemnly beside Lenin's coffin, weeping publicly and addressing the fallen leader as "our father." The crowd, exhausted by years of war and scarcity, wanted continuity. They didn't want another ideological crusade. They wanted someone who would keep the machine running. Stalin offered exactly that illusion: order amid chaos. Trotsky, meanwhile, was thousands of miles away in the Caucasus, supposedly ill, missing the funeral entirely. In politics, timing is everything, and Trotsky's absence was a fatal cough. Over the next few months, you'd watch Stalin move with unnerving patience. He aligned himself first with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, old Bolsheviks who distrusted Trotsky's arrogance. Together, they isolated him within the party, accusing him of factionalism, that mortal sin of communist unity. Trotsky, ever the idealist, thought logic and truth could defend him. But logic doesn't stand much chance when the votes have already been counted by your opponent's friends. It's around this time that Stalin perfects one of his favorite tactics: divide and absorb. Once Trotsky is weakened, Stalin quietly turns on Zinoviev and Kamenev too. He accuses them of opportunism, replacing them with newer, younger loyalists who owe their positions entirely to him. He's turning the party into a pyramid with himself at the top, unshakable. The very system meant to ensure collective leadership now orbits around one man's gravitational pull. One quirky detail that doesn't make it into most textbooks: Stalin had a habit of inviting rivals to dinner, showering them with warmth, vodka, and praise, then using whatever they said while drunk against them later. You'd never know if an evening toast was a sign of friendship or your final meal as a free man. People started refusing invitations. Stalin noticed, of course. He always noticed. Still, for now, the facade remains civil. The Politburo meetings are thick with forced smiles and cautious applause. Trotsky still writes for Pravda. Zinoviev still holds speeches in Leningrad. But the undercurrent is unmistakable. Fear beginning to ferment under the veneer of unity. Stalin's allies whisper of a new line, one that prioritizes loyalty over debate. The revolution, once so full of fiery disagreement, is learning to keep its voice down. Outside these marble offices, the Soviet Union itself feels raw and restless. Civil war wounds haven't yet healed. The countryside is a patchwork of hunger and resentment. Peasants grumble about grain requisitions, workers complain about shortages, and whispers of counter-revolution still hang in the air. The new leader, whoever truly controls the party, will need both ruthlessness and patience to hold it all together. Stalin has both in abundance. By 1925, Trotsky's star has faded to a cold ember. His supporters in the Red Army are quietly reassigned or retired. Even his writings begin to vanish from libraries, replaced by a new orthodoxy of Stalin-approved doctrine. At meetings, his name is mentioned less and less, as though collective memory itself is being edited. Historians call it the politics of silence, where erasure becomes the ultimate weapon. There's a certain irony to it all. The man who wrote volumes about permanent revolution now finds himself permanently out of it. And Stalin, who once stumbled over words in Lenin's shadow, becomes the voice of the party. You can almost hear the tone shift in the official speeches. Less theory, more slogans. Less debate, more commands. At night, in your imagination, Moscow's skyline glows faintly under electric light. New towers, new bureaucracy, new fear. The same government that once toppled czars is slowly creating its own throne. Stalin isn't just inheriting Lenin's revolution, he's rebuilding it in his own image. Pragmatic, secretive, and mercilessly organized. One mainstream fact worth holding on to. By the late 1920s, Stalin had successfully transformed the Communist Party's internal structure. What was once a collective body of decision-makers became a hierarchy centered around him. Even Lenin's widow, Nadezhda Krupskaya, privately voiced alarm at what she saw, though she too learned the hard way that criticism could shorten one's lifespan. A fringe tidbit you might appreciate. Around this time, Stalin commissions the embalming of Lenin's corpse, literally turning his former boss into a symbol that would never die. Visitors line up to see the preserved body, but to insiders it's clear. Lenin's mausoleum isn't a tribute, it's a stage prop. Stalin is performing continuity, wrapping his rise in the scent of sanctity. Historians still argue whether Lenin, had he lived longer, could have stopped this transformation, or whether Stalin's rise was baked into the DNA of the party itself. Centralized power breeds centralized rulers. Perhaps it was inevitable. Either way, by 1926, the die is cast. You feel it in the silence of the corridors, in the way people start pausing before using certain names. In those moments of stillness, as snow falls on Red Square and the Kremlin's red stars blink through the mist, you realize something eerie. The revolution has begun devouring its own. Not yet with bullets or gulags, those will come later, but with whispers, demotions, and disappearances from photographs. And as you stand there, candlelight flickering against Lenin's preserved face, you can almost sense a second presence in the room, a shadow, patient and calculating, already rewriting the script. Stalin isn't just surviving the power struggle. He's quietly winning it, one cautious smile at a time. You can almost feel the temperature drop in Moscow as the year 1925 slips into 1926. The capital is humming with new slogans: industrialization, socialism in one country, unity of purpose. But underneath that optimism, there's a quiet sense of menace. You walk past the posters on brick walls, the kind that shout in red paint about progress and loyalty. And you wonder if the paint is still wet or if it's just the blood of someone's career drying underneath. Leon Trotsky, once the heroic commander of the Red Army, is now reduced to an awkward figure pacing his office, still convinced the revolution needs his intellect. He pens essays about the degeneration of the party, confident that reason will prevail. You almost want to tell him, reason has no place in this game anymore. Stalin isn't debating ideas, he's rewriting the rule book itself. The great irony is that Trotsky helped design the very system that's now destroying him. The centralized power of the Communist Party, built to survive foreign invasion and civil war, has become Stalin's private instrument. He doesn't argue his rivals into submission. He promotes over them, replaces them, isolates them until their names vanish from the minutes of meetings. It's 1926, and the Troika, Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, has fractured. Their alliance, once built on fear of Trotsky, has served its purpose. Stalin, with his steady patience and almost clerical attention to detail, begins cutting his partners loose. Zinoviev and Kamenev still believe they have ideological footing. They think they can appeal to Lenin's memory, to the party's conscience. But conscience doesn't vote. Delegates do. And Stalin has been quietly appointing those delegates for years. You picture a party Congress hall, a sea of faces, all applauding on cue, none daring to meet your eyes. Somewhere in the front row, Stalin claps too, a small smile curling under that mustache. He knows the choreography. Enthusiasm first, loyalty second, fear always. By 1927, the writing on the Kremlin wall is clear. Trotsky is stripped of his final posts. He's accused of counter-revolutionary activities, a phrase so vague it could mean anything, from criticizing the 5-year plan to sneezing during a meeting. He's expelled from the party, banished from Moscow to Alma-Ata, deep in Central Asia, a political exile wrapped in snow. And Stalin? He's consolidating faster than anyone can comprehend. He's appointed allies to the Central Committee, stacked the regional secretariats, and turned the secret police, the OGPU, soon to morph into the NKVD, into an arm of his will. You might think of it as a bureaucratic takeover, but it's more like watching a forest quietly catch fire under the roots, invisible until it's too late to stop. Trotsky writes bitter letters from exile, warning that Stalin is betraying the revolution. He dreams of returning, of rallying old comrades, but history doesn't wait for dreamers. In 1929, his warnings are silenced for good. Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union entirely, wandering from Turkey to Norway to Mexico. His voice becomes an echo, fading from radio broadcasts and newsprint. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin is just getting started. With Trotsky gone, he no longer needs to pretend to be the humble secretary. He begins constructing what he calls the Socialist Offensive, a vast reorganization of Soviet life. You, standing somewhere in the background of this unfolding drama, can feel the ground shift under your boots. Here's the mainstream fact. 1929 marks Stalin's undisputed control over the Communist Party and the Soviet state. He holds both the general secretaryship and influence over every major committee that matters. His word, though still couched in the language of collective decision, is effectively law. The party that once prided itself on debate now operates like an echo chamber. But power, once seized, must be justified. And that's where Stalin's genius lies. He frames every move as defense of Lenin's legacy. He's not purging rivals, he's protecting the revolution. He's not silencing dissent, he's safeguarding unity. It's a linguistic sleight of hand so effective that even victims sometimes confess to crimes they never committed, believing the party's will must be right. A quirky tidbit. Stalin wasn't fond of public speaking early on. He preferred to let others deliver speeches while he edited their drafts behind the scenes. His handwriting, blocky, blunt, unmistakably firm, can still be seen scrawled across meeting notes. Delete this, rephrase that, too lenient. His edits became the blueprint for fear. By the early 1930s, you sense the tone of public life changing. Newspapers no longer print debates about economic theory. They print confessions, quotas, and slogans. Stalin's portraits start appearing everywhere, from factories to village schools, his gaze following you like a saint's icon. The revolution that promised freedom from tyranny now worships a man who's mastering it. But even Stalin can't rule without reshaping the country itself. The Soviet Union is about to embark on one of the most brutal transformations in human history: collectivization. On paper, it's a plan to modernize agriculture, bringing millions of small peasant farms under state control. In practice, it's a declaration of war on the countryside. Peasants, who'd fought and died for the revolution, now find their grain requisitioned by the state. Resistance is labeled sabotage. Refusal is treason. Those with a few cows or a slightly larger plot, the so-called kulaks, are branded enemies of the people. Entire families are deported to Siberia or forced labor camps. Villages empty overnight. The trains fill with the sound of crying children and rattling tin cups. You, trudging down a snow-covered road, would see it firsthand. Farmers burning their crops rather than surrender them. Others hanging portraits of Lenin next to Stalin's in confused hope that one might protect them from the other. Historians still argue whether Stalin believed the terror was necessary modernization or simply relished the control it gave him. Perhaps both. The famine that follows, especially in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, is staggering. Millions perish. Official statistics downplay it, of course. The party blames bad weather, not policy. But in whispered accounts, you'd hear stories of desperation so bleak they barely sound human. The revolution's dream of equality has curdled into survival at any cost. Inside the cities, fear becomes currency. People learn not to ask questions when their neighbor's window goes dark overnight. At party meetings, comrades denounce each other before being denounced themselves. It's not yet the Great Purge, but you can smell the smoke before the fire. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's paranoia blossoms into policy. He's convinced that enemies, internal and external, are conspiring against him. The German threat is growing in Europe. Japan is flexing in Asia. And at home, the memory of Lenin's more open party still lingers. That, Stalin decides, must be erased completely. Historians call this period the tightening. The NKVD expands, lists grow, interrogations begin to blur the line between guilt and imagination. You can feel the transformation. A regime that once justified repression as emergency now normalizes it as governance. And through it all, Stalin watches, calculating. He's turned politics into a test of faith, where loyalty is measured by how loudly you agree. Rivals like Bukharin, once close allies, start trembling during speeches. Even Stalin's inner circle can't tell whether his smile means approval or doom. One night, somewhere in a Moscow apartment, a man burns old letters in a stove, the paper curling into ash. He used to quote Trotsky. He used to dream of equality. Now, he dreams only of staying invisible. You lean closer to the warmth of that fire and realize what's happening. The revolution has entered its nocturnal phase. Everything once bright and idealistic now glows faintly red, flickering with menace. Stalin hasn't just outmaneuvered his rivals. He's rewritten the emotional temperature of an entire nation. And as snow falls outside the Kremlin, silent and endless, you sense the beginning of something darker still. The machinery of repression has been built, oiled, and tested. The next time it runs, it will run on human lives. You wake to the distant thud of factory sirens echoing over the Moscow River. The city hums like a machine now, every worker a cog, every movement time to the rhythm of the 5-year plan. The year is 1930, and Joseph Stalin, formerly the gray blur of the party, is now the sun around which every orbit must align. You feel it in the posters, the speeches, the way the air itself seems to vibrate with slogans. Production is power. Obedience is patriotism. Inside the party headquarters, you might pass a line of men waiting outside Stalin's office, each clutching reports, letters, promises. Their faces blur into the same expression, fear disguised as devotion. When the door opens, a thick haze of pipe smoke curls out, and you catch a glimpse of the man himself, small, immovable, like a shadow that forgot how to leave the room. This is where it all begins, where Stalin turns the title of General Secretary into something far beyond bureaucracy. You'd think secretaries take notes. Stalin takes lives. The transformation happens quietly, like a bureaucratic miracle. Every promotion now flows through him. Every dismissal carries his invisible signature. Regional officials, factory managers, even village leaders owe their existence to Stalin's approval. It's an empire built not on charisma or ideology, but on paperwork, loyalty, and fear. He's still pretending to share power with the Politburo, but only technically. He lets others talk, then sums up with that deceptively calm line. So, comrades agree? And of course, everyone agrees. A mainstream historical fact. Between 1929 and 1934, Stalin oversaw the most radical centralization of authority in Soviet history. Even the term Stalinism wasn't yet official. It simply described reality. Ministries, regional committees, and local Soviets lost autonomy. The secret police, the OGPU, reported directly to him. And he used that apparatus to launch one of the most sweeping social transformations ever attempted: the drive to industrialize a backward, largely agrarian state in a single decade. The costs would be astronomical, both in rubles and human lives. You can almost hear the clamor of construction sites at Magnitogorsk, the crash of hammers, the hiss of steel poured into molds. Posters show smiling workers with biceps like marble statues, beaming under red flags. But if you could step closer, you'd see frostbitten hands, overcrowded barracks, food lines stretching for blocks. Progress, Stalin insists, must be paid for in suffering. Grain is our gold, he declares. To feed the growing cities and sell exports abroad, the state squeezes the countryside harder. Collectivization becomes law. Peasants are ordered to surrender private land, animals, and tools to vast state-run farms. Resistance erupts immediately. Villagers slaughter livestock rather than hand them over. Grain disappears into hidden cellars. The OGPU responds with brutality: arrests, deportations, executions. Stalin labels the rebels kulaks, class enemies masquerading as farmers. You can almost feel the chill in those words. How effortlessly humanity vanishes behind ideology. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit: propaganda posters at the time depicted kulaks as grotesque caricatures, fat, pig-snouted figures hoarding sacks of wheat, an absurd cartoon of greed used to justify their extermination. Children in schools were told to report parents who hid grain for the old world. The revolution had become a spy game played in every kitchen. By 1932, the toll is unimaginable. In Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus, famine tightens its grip. Entire villages disappear. It's called the Holodomor in Ukrainian memory, the hunger extermination. Official records speak in euphemisms: food difficulties, local mismanagement, but eyewitnesses described fields of unharvested crops guarded by soldiers while peasants starve beside them. Historians still argue whether Stalin intended the famine as deliberate punishment or simply ignored its scale. Some point to telegrams showing he knew the extent and ordered grain exports anyway. Others say the system's chaos, not malice, created catastrophe. Either way, you watch millions vanish into unmarked graves, their names never recorded, their stories erased by silence. And yet, in Moscow, Stalin's prestige grows. His face appears in newspapers alongside smiling factory workers and steel furnaces. "The 5-year plan fulfilled in 4, the headlines shout. The ghost of Lenin may still rest in Red Square, but the cult of Stalin is alive, expanding, unstoppable. In private, his habits remain simple. Black tea, cheap tobacco, quiet evenings reading police reports. He doesn't drink much, but he watches others drink. He prefers to let them talk until they reveal something useful or fatal. His staff learns the rule. The more jovial Stalin sounds, the more dangerous the night will be. You might think the party would see what's happening, but ambition blinds as much as fear. Each official hopes to stay useful. Each commissar prays to remain unseen. People whisper that even Stalin's inner circle isn't safe, that the walls have ears, and those ears belong to the NKVD. The NKVD, by the way, isn't yet the monstrous organization it will become, but its roots are already deep. It maintains files on everyone, neighbors, workers, even Politburo members. The archives grow so vast that clerks joke about running out of paper, though no one laughs too loudly. Meanwhile, foreign observers visiting Moscow see only the surface. Western journalists, invited to model factories, write glowing pieces about Soviet progress. They photograph parades, gleaming subways, and marching youth. Few realize those same parades march past prisons overflowing with the disloyal. By 1933, Stalin has survived every political rival. Zinoviev and Kamenev, once comrades, are humiliated and expelled. Bukharin still clings to hope, writing essays about the need for balance between terror and trust. But the very word balance now sounds suspicious. A new ritual enters Soviet life: the self-criticism session. In factories, schools, and offices, workers are encouraged to confess small mistakes, denounce colleagues, and reaffirm loyalty to the party. It's therapy turned theater, morality as surveillance. The result is chillingly effective. Citizens learn to accuse before being accused. You picture one of these sessions in a Moscow publishing office. A man stands before his peers, trembling. He admits to bourgeois tendencies because he once read foreign poetry. His co-workers nod solemnly, then clap when he vows to change. Later, as he leaves, 2 NKVD agents quietly note his name anyway. That's the new rhythm of Soviet life. Confession, applause, arrest. By 1934, Stalin feels untouchable. The country has electrified, industrial output has tripled, and the old revolutionary generation is either sidelined or silenced. The 17th Party Congress convenes that year, the so-called Congress of Victors. Delegates praise Stalin endlessly, declaring the socialist state stronger than ever. But even amid the applause, you sense unease. The delegates don't know it yet, but more than half of them will be dead within 4 years. In the middle of this triumph stands Sergei Kirov, the charismatic party leader of Leningrad, popular, articulate, a man people actually like. Stalin pretends to like him too. At banquets, he raises toasts to Kirov's revolutionary zeal. Yet whispers swirl that Stalin resents his charm, fears his popularity. The audience may not realize it, but they're watching a tragedy assemble itself in slow motion. A fringe historical curiosity. Kirov's office in Smolny was reportedly bugged by the NKVD weeks before his assassination. Whether Stalin ordered it directly is still debated. Some historians believe he simply let the inevitable happen. Others think he planned it meticulously, needing a spark to light the coming inferno. You can almost hear the footsteps in the marble hallway of December 1st, 1934. Leonid Nikolaev, a disgruntled party member, pulls a pistol. One shot to the back of Kirov's head, and the world changes. Stalin appears grief-stricken, demanding swift justice. But his version of justice will stretch beyond reason. Within hours, the NKVD sweeps through Leningrad, arresting hundreds. Within weeks, thousands. The narrative solidifies. Kirov's death was part of a vast conspiracy of Zinovievists and Trotskyites. It's absurd. Zinoviev has been in political exile. Trotsky is half a continent away. But the logic of fear doesn't need evidence. Historians still argue whether Kirov's murder was a spontaneous act or a state-sanctioned trigger. What's certain is what followed. Stalin uses the tragedy to authorize special powers for the NKVD, summary trials, secret executions, limitless surveillance. The Great Purge's fuse is lit. Outside, winter deepens over Moscow. People walk faster, talk quieter, sleep lighter. Every knock on the door sounds like history arriving. And from his office window, Stalin watches the snow fall. Expression unreadable, as though calculating how much more cold the nation can endure. Snow drifts across the Neva River, settling on the rooftops of Leningrad like a pale shroud. It's early December 1934, only days since Sergei Kirov's assassination, and the city's silence feels unnatural. You can hear the boots of patrols crunching through ice, the muffled bark of orders echoing through alleys. People speak in whispers, if they speak at all. Somewhere in a government office, Joseph Stalin reads the first NKVD reports on the murder, his expression unreadable. Pipe smoke curling upward like a question mark no one dares to answer. Within hours, the machinery of vengeance begins to move. Stalin frames Kirov's death as proof of a vast conspiracy. The alleged masterminds? His old rivals, Zinoviev, Kamenev, the Trotskyite Zinovievite bloc. It's absurd, but the logic of terror doesn't require evidence. It only requires repetition. By morning, the newspapers are already calling for cleansing the party of traitors and wreckers. You can imagine the corridors of the Smolny Institute lit all night, interrogators hammering out confessions. The NKVD men are eager, fueled by vodka and fear in equal measure. One officer later recalls how easy it became to make people talk. We didn't need to beat them. They beat themselves with guilt. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin paces slowly, dictating to his secretaries. He orders sweeping arrests, demands new legislation allowing speedier justice. What that really means is no lawyers, no appeals, no delays. Within days, hundreds are executed for supposed involvement in Kirov's plot. The revolution that once promised liberation now writes death warrants in Lenin's old office. Here's the mainstream historical fact. On the 1st of December 1934, Stalin personally signed a decree authorizing the NKVD to conduct immediate trials and executions for suspected terrorists. This became the legal foundation of the Great Purge. Every subsequent wave of arrests, every night knock on the door, would trace its lineage back to this document. You'd think people would be terrified, and they are, but they're also strangely energized. Newspapers filling with denunciations, editorials praising Stalin's vigilance. It's performative hysteria, a public exorcism of invisible demons. If you don't join the chorus, you risk becoming the next ghost. A quirky tidbit buried in memoirs. Stalin had a phonograph record made of Kirov's funeral march. He would sometimes play it late at night in his study, staring at the wall as the dirge filled the room. No one knows if it was grief or theater. Maybe both. By early 1935, the NKVD's prisons are overflowing. Entire departments are purged. Regional party committees are told to expose conspirators. What that means in practice is quotas, numbers of arrests expected from each region, as if loyalty can be measured in corpses. The officials compete to exceed them. You, an ordinary citizen, Start to adjust to new reflexes. Never mention names in public. Never repeat a joke. Never trust the neighbor who smiles too much. The city begins to feel like a chessboard where everyone suspects they're already in check. Historians still argue whether Stalin truly believed in a vast conspiracy or cynically invented it to justify control. Some think his paranoia was genuine, a side effect of the endless purges and betrayals that defined his early life. Others see it as cold strategy, a way to keep the elite terrified and obedient. Either way, belief and manipulation merge into one. Meanwhile, Trotsky, thousands of miles away in exile, writes fiery essays accusing Stalin of building a bureaucratic thermidor. His words reach the Soviet Union only in smuggled fragments, but Stalin reads them, underlines phrases, mutters that the old traitor still dreams. The rivalry that began a decade earlier now becomes mythic. Two revolutionaries locked in a duel, neither will survive. In 1936, the first great show trial begins, the Trial of the 16. Zinoviev and Kamenev, once among Lenin's closest allies, now stand in a courtroom beneath the giant emblem of the Soviet Union. They look hollow, their faces sagging under sleepless nights. When the charges are read, treason, terrorism, collusion with foreign powers, you can almost hear the absurdity echo through the hall. But the defendants confess. They confess to everything. How could they? You might ask that, sitting in the audience, heart pounding. The answer is complicated. Weeks of interrogation, threats to families, promises of a painless end, and a strange, tragic loyalty. These men still believe in the party, even as it destroys them. Better to die for the revolution than against it, Kamenev whispers before his final speech. The court stenographers capture every word, and newspapers print the confessions verbatim. The public reads them like a serialized novel. In cafes, people nod. See, the enemies were among us all along. Fear turns to righteous fury. Stalin, of course, pretends reluctance. They were comrades once, but the people demand justice. Mainstream fact: all 16 defendants were executed within 24 hours of sentencing. Their families disappeared soon after. The trials weren't about guilt, they were about spectacle. They told the nation that no one, not even the founders of Bolshevism, stood above suspicion. A fringe historical curiosity. The chief prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky, had once been a Menshevik, a rival socialist who fled when the Bolsheviks seized power. Now he shouts for the death of men who once spared his life. Stalin must have smiled at that symmetry. Outside the courtroom, the terror spreads like an epidemic. Factory managers are accused of wrecking machinery, engineers of sabotage, teachers of counter-revolutionary propaganda. Even the weather becomes suspect. A bad harvest is blamed on hidden traitors. You can feel the paranoia thick in the air, as if Moscow itself is holding its breath. At night, the black cars roll quietly down empty streets, the infamous Chornaya Voronka, the Black Raven. Their engines idle outside apartment blocks while agents climb staircases in soft boots. They knock politely, almost gently. Inside, families freeze. Everyone knows the rule. Don't run, don't argue, don't ask where they're taking you. You'll find out soon enough. The Lubyanka prison glows with light all night now. Interrogators work in shifts, pushing beyond exhaustion. Paperwork piles up. Bullets are cheaper than ink. You imagine an officer signing forms until his hand cramps, stamping "enemy of the people" again and again until the phrase loses meaning. And through it all, Stalin remains distant, deliberate. Each morning he reviews execution lists sent by the NKVD. In red pencil, he marks approvals. Shoot. Sometimes he adds sarcastic notes. Scum, traitor, bandit. Other times, he simply underlines the name once, as though drawing a curtain over a life. Inside the Kremlin, no one questions him. To doubt a signature is to invite your own. The myth of infallibility hardens. Stalin doesn't make mistakes. Reality does. Historians still debate the psychology behind this control. Was Stalin consumed by genuine paranoia, or did he simply understand terror as an instrument of statecraft? Whichever answer you prefer, the outcome is the same: obedience through dread. One quirky but chilling anecdote. A typist in Stalin's office once accidentally misspelled his name in a memo. Stalin with 2 L's. She was never seen again. Her replacement typed flawlessly. By 1937, the terror is no longer exceptional. It's routine. The bureaucracy has learned its rhythm. The arrests have quotas. Whole categories of citizens are targeted in waves. Former nobles, clergy, foreigners, Poles, even loyal party members whose only crime is seniority. You can sense that the revolution has turned fully inward, devouring the generation that birthed it. And yet, in propaganda films, life looks glorious. Tractors roar across new fields, workers cheer, choirs sing hymns to Stalin. The son of nations, they call him. If you didn't know better, you might believe it. That's the point. The brighter the propaganda, the darker the night outside. Somewhere in a small apartment, a mother rocks her child to sleep, whispering lullabies over the distant rumble of engines. She's teaching the only lesson that still matters. Never say too much, never trust silence, and never, ever dream out loud. The Great Purge is still gathering speed. The worst is yet to come. But in this moment, this breath between executions, the Soviet Union stands suspended, caught between the illusion of order and the abyss of fear. Stalin, sitting beneath a single lamp in his office, smiles faintly as he signs another decree. He's not just rewriting history now, he's erasing it in real time. The year is 1937, and Moscow no longer sleeps. The nights hum with engines and whispers. The streets gleam with frost under lamplight, but no one lingers long enough to admire the beauty. You can almost taste the fear in the air. It has texture now, like iron dust on your tongue. The Great Purge has begun in earnest, and it doesn't matter who you are anymore. Soldier, scholar, poet, or peasant. No one is beyond suspicion. Stalin sits in his Kremlin office, walls lined with maps and lists. The red pencil in his hand moves with unhurried precision. The names are endless: generals, party members, engineers, even the secret police themselves. Each line he underlines seals a fate. You imagine him humming softly, perhaps an old Georgian tune, as he signs one more execution order before bed. Outside those walls, the Soviet Union is transforming into an enormous prison, one that pretends to be a paradise. Posters proclaim life has become happier as trains full of prisoners rattle east toward the camps. Radio broadcasts praise the purity of the party, while thousands vanish overnight. In your apartment block, people avoid eye contact in the stairwell. The sound of footsteps after midnight means another door will open and never close again. Here's the mainstream fact. Between 1936 and 1938, roughly 1.5 million people were arrested under political charges, and at least 700,000 were executed. Millions more were sent to labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. This wasn't collateral damage, it was policy. And yet, Stalin presents it as a cleansing. We are removing the dust from the party, he says. We are cutting out infection before it spreads. His logic is terrifyingly simple. If anyone might oppose him, they already have. The NKVD, now led by Nikolai Yezhov, becomes both executioner and victim. Yezhov is small in stature, his sharp eyes perpetually tired, his smile rehearsed. Stalin calls him the little one, almost affectionately. Under his command, the NKVD expands arrests into the provinces, targeting entire social groups. Former kulaks, foreign spies, wreckers, Trotskyite conspirators. The Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov era, turns the Soviet Union into a self-consuming organism. In one absurd case, a farmer is accused of being a Japanese spy, though he's never left his village. Another man is denounced for counter-revolutionary whistling. You'd laugh if it weren't true. A quirky tidbit: the NKVD sometimes filled quotas by picking random names from phone books. In some offices, they drew lots. Fear became a lottery you couldn't avoid playing. Even the interrogators begin to unravel. One, later interviewed after the war, said, "We stopped asking what people did. We asked what they hadn't done yet." The show trials continue, each one more surreal than the last. The Trial of the 17 in January 1937 accuses men like Karl Radek and Georgy Pyatakov, intellectuals and economists, of plotting sabotage and espionage with foreign powers. The script is familiar: confessions wrung from exhaustion and terror, applause from the gallery, swift death sentences. Historians still debate how much of the public truly believed these confessions. Some did. After years of propaganda, it was easier to believe in conspiracies than to accept the truth that the revolution had turned cannibal. Others simply pretended to believe. Pretending was safer. Meanwhile, the NKVD's reach expands to the armed forces. Stalin, haunted by whispers of disloyalty, suspects the Red Army of plotting a coup. He orders purges of its highest ranks: marshals, generals, colonels. Even Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most brilliant strategists of the age, is arrested, tortured, and executed. A mainstream fact: of the Red Army's top commanders, nearly half are removed. Roughly 4 to 8% of officers are executed, many more imprisoned or dismissed. For a modern military, it's like cutting out its brain and expecting it to keep walking. A fringe historical curiosity: German intelligence intercepted forged documents planted by the NKVD, proving that Tukhachevsky conspired with the Nazis. Hitler reportedly found this so convincing that he used it later as justification for his own purges of the Wehrmacht. One dictator inspiring another through forged paranoia. History's cruel joke. And yet, Stalin's control tightens. The Central Committee meets less frequently, and when it does, the atmosphere is suffocating. Delegates speak only to affirm. The very idea of disagreement becomes heresy. You can imagine sitting in that hall, rows of men sweating under portraits of Lenin and Stalin, wondering if a wrong word might mark your last sunrise. The terror is efficient. Bureaucrats denounce subordinates to save themselves. Factory foremen report sabotage to explain low quotas. Even families betray relatives to protect the rest. The country learns to survive by accusation. The most haunting detail isn't the arrests, it's the applause. Every execution order, every trial verdict is followed by thunderous clapping. Not because people approve, but because the silence afterward might be mistaken for dissent. One night, you sit in your apartment, lights off, listening. A truck stops outside. You freeze. It idles for a few seconds, an eternity, and then drives on. You exhale, trembling. You've survived another night. Somewhere else, someone didn't. Historians still argue about Stalin's motive. Was this about eliminating threats? Or was it an attempt to build a new, purer Soviet identity, defined by obedience? Perhaps both. Stalin himself offered the chilling rationale: better to arrest 10 innocent men than let one enemy escape. A darkly comic joke circulates in Moscow at the time. Why are you clapping? Because they haven't stopped yet. No one laughs aloud. By 1938, the purges reach their peak. Yezhov, once the terror's conductor, now becomes its next victim. Stalin replaces him with Lavrenti Beria, a cunning Georgian with a face like polished stone. Within months, Yezhov is arrested, accused of excesses, and executed. The machine swallows its own operator, resets, and keeps grinding. Stalin appears calm throughout, occasionally hosting banquets where he jokes about his overzealous comrades. He still reads poetry, still invites friends for late-night film screenings. The contrast between his private warmth and public cruelty is dizzying. A quirky but humanizing note. Stalin loved old Georgian songs and could recite poetry from memory. Sometimes he'd make guests sing folk tunes with him at 2 a.m., the same guests who might be arrested the next morning. The line between friendship and death had vanished. By the end of the Purge, the Soviet Union is unrecognizable. Entire villages have new populations, party records are rewritten, and the archives groan with false confessions. A generation of revolutionaries is gone, erased not just from life, but from history books and photographs. And yet, in a twisted way, the country is unified as never before. The fear itself becomes glue, holding millions together in shared silence. The regime has created the perfect paradox, total instability that ensures total control. As 1938 fades into 1939, the terror begins to cool. Stalin, satisfied or perhaps simply tired, calls for restraint. The NKVD is reformed, quotas reduced, executions slow. It's not mercy, it's maintenance. You don't burn down the entire forest when you plan to live in it. Still, the damage lingers like a fever dream. The Soviet Union enters the new decade paranoid, hollowed out, but obedient. Those who survive learn to applaud louder, smile faster, and forget quicker. And you, drifting through those dim Moscow streets at dawn, hear the faint echo of boots on cobblestone, the ghosts of millions walking home in silence. The revolution has completed its circle, devouring its children and crowning its executioner. You look up at the Kremlin spires, glowing red against the mist, and realize that in Stalin's world, history isn't written by the victors. It's written by the survivors. And there aren't many left to hold the pen. Morning light creeps through the narrow windows of the Kremlin, turning the frost on the glass into tiny stars. Inside, Stalin sits at his desk, surrounded by files stacked like tombstones. Each folder bears a name, a story, and usually a red line scrawled across the cover. You can almost hear the scratch of his pencil as he moves from one report to another, the sound quiet but final, like snow falling over a graveyard. The Great Purge has burned through the party's old guard, but Stalin isn't finished. Now he turns his attention outward, towards society itself. The machinery of fear that once targeted political rivals begins to engulf ordinary people. Farmers, professors, engineers, janitors. Everyone becomes a potential suspect. Loyalty alone isn't protection. In Stalin's world, the innocent are useful only as proof that no one is safe. The NKVD's quotas expand again in 1937 and 1938. Transforming repression into arithmetic. Each regional director receives an official number of enemies to uncover. The bureaucracy of death is chillingly efficient. The lists come from above, and the names are filled in from below. Sometimes they're neighbors, sometimes co-workers, sometimes total strangers. The statistics look neat in Moscow, but out in the provinces, the air is thick with screams and silence. One mainstream fact. In 1937 to 1938, roughly 1.3 million people were arrested during the NKVD's national operations. These were special campaigns targeting ethnic minorities, clergy, and anyone with a foreign-sounding surname. Roughly half of those arrested were executed. The rest vanished into the Gulag archipelago. You walk through the streets of Leningrad, seeing posters of smiling peasants beneath slogans like, "The motherland is watching." It's almost funny if it weren't so terrifying. The same motherland that watches also listens and takes notes. Radios broadcast endless speeches about vigilance. Newspapers print editorials praising citizens who report suspicious behavior. The art of survival becomes the art of silence. Somewhere in a tenement kitchen, a family debates whether to burn old letters. The mother insists on it. The father hesitates. There's a line from a banned poet in one of them. Finally, they throw it into the stove. The flames crackle, soft and clean. You realize that, In Stalin's USSR, even paper has to be careful what it says. A quirky tidbit from memoirs. The NKVD once arrested an entire chess club in Odessa because one member had jokingly referred to counter moves against the party. The joke didn't age well. Every man was interrogated. The tournament never resumed. But while society trembles, Stalin's inner circle pretends at normalcy. The banquets continue. Vodka flows. Stalin makes jokes that no one dares not to laugh at. One night, he raises a toast to the health of those who are loyal and to the memory of those who were not. Everyone laughs, everyone drinks. No one sleeps afterward. Historians still argue whether Stalin believed his own propaganda. Was he truly convinced that spies lurked in every shadow, or did he simply understand paranoia as the perfect political instrument? Either way, he cultivates it like a garden. Fear blooms where reason used to grow. Outside the Kremlin, new targets emerge. Scientists accused of sabotaging industrial plans. Writers blamed for bourgeois pessimism. Military engineers arrested for wrecking. In 1938, even meteorologists are charged with deliberately producing bad weather. You almost have to admire the creativity. At the same time, Stalin extends his purge beyond social classes to nations themselves. The NKVD launches what it calls national operations. Mass arrests of Poles, Germans, Latvians, Koreans, Finns. The Polish operation alone sweeps up over 140,000 people. More than 100,000 are executed. There's no logic to it. Entire families disappear simply for having Polish-sounding names. Mainstream historians cite this as one of the most ethnically targeted campaigns in Soviet history. It wasn't about espionage. It was ethnic cleansing disguised as state security. A whole borderland is emptied, its villages replaced by silence, a fringe historical curiosity. In one NKVD memo, an officer complained that there are not enough Poles left in the district to fulfill the quota. The reply came back within days: use Lithuanians. Meanwhile, in far-off Kazakhstan and Siberia, the Gulag camps overflow. Prisoners quarry stone, fell trees, dig canals through permafrost. The guards joke that only the frost is truly free. Those who survive describe the landscape as a geography of suffering. And yet, propaganda films show cheerful workers building socialism. The disconnect between image and reality is almost surreal. You watch a cinema reel titled "Life is Better, Life is Happier," while knowing that somewhere not far away, thousands are digging mass graves beneath the snow. But Stalin isn't blind to optics. In late 1938, sensing international attention and internal fatigue, he begins to dial the terror back, or at least to redirect it. The NKVD's excesses are blamed on Yezhov, who is quietly replaced by Lavrenti Beria. Yezhov himself, after months of interrogation, is executed in 1940. Stalin refers to him afterward as that little vampire. The pattern repeats. Purge, replace, blame, repeat. Each wave consumes its creators, leaving Stalin untouched, almost untouchable. His genius lies not in ideology, but in survival. A mainstream fact: by 1939, about 1 in every 18 adult Soviet males had been arrested or executed during the purges. The demographic shock would haunt the nation for decades. In entire regions, there were no men left between 30 and 50 years old. Still, Stalin's state carries on, a paradoxical blend of terror and triumph. The factories run, the subways hum, the parades march on schedule. People learn to compartmentalize, to cheer in public and cry in private. One quirky observation from a survivor: we clapped because we were alive to clap. That was enough. You wander through Red Square on May Day, the air thick with banners and music. A column of young pioneers passes, waving flags and shouting slogans about the glorious future. Their faces are bright, untouched by what surrounds them. They don't know that the buildings lining the square are filled with prisoners awaiting trial. It's as if two realities coexist, the dream and the nightmare, divided only by walls. Historians still debate what drove Stalin to such extremes. Some argue it was the legacy of constant war and insecurity. A leader born in revolution could trust no peace. Others see a psychological void, a man consumed by control for its own sake. Perhaps, as one scholar put it, Stalin feared losing power more than death itself. And yet, the strangest thing happens. Despite the fear, the USSR begins to stabilize. Industrial production soars, literacy rises, and the new Soviet generation, raised in terror but taught discipline, emerges fiercely patriotic. It's a twisted success story, built on bones but shining with steel. By 1939, as Europe drifts toward another world war, Stalin stands alone atop his mountain of power. The party is silent, the army obedient, the people subdued. Even the NKVD, now under Beria's control, trembles at his glance. The revolution that once promised freedom has become an empire of obedience. But you can't help noticing, there's something weary in the air now, like a fever breaking. The arrests slow. The black cars still drive at night, but less often. Families start to whisper again, quietly, about the future. Maybe the storm has passed. Or maybe, you think, it's only circling back for another season. Stalin stubs out his pipe, looks at a map of Europe, and mutters something about Germany and Poland. He's already planning the next game. The purges may have ended for now, but the machinery of control, the culture of fear, will keep running, humming softly beneath the surface of Soviet life for decades. And somewhere far away, in Mexico, an exiled man named Leon Trotsky sharpens his pen, and his awareness that Stalin's shadow is long and still moving toward him. The air in Moscow grows thicker with unease as 1939 approaches. And though the gunfire of the purges has quieted, the silence feels no less suffocating. The streets still glitter under frost. The factories still thunder, but the rhythm has changed. It's not the pulse of progress anymore. It's the aftershock of trauma. You can feel it even in the way people walk, heads down, collars up, always half listening for footsteps that aren't there. The purges have slowed, yes, but the fear they planted now lives rent-free in every Soviet soul. Stalin, meanwhile, seems calmer than ever. He appears at parades, jokes with journalists, even grants interviews that paint him as a fatherly figure of the people. In one photo, he's smiling beneath a wreath of flowers, holding a young girl who calls him Uncle Joe. You know the image. It's become iconic. But behind that gentle grin lies a man who's already planning his next move. Stalin doesn't rest. He recalibrates. Here's the mainstream fact. By 1939, Stalin's control is total. The party is purged of opposition, the army decapitated and rebuilt under loyal officers, and the NKVD restructured under Lavrenti Beria, ruthless, cunning, and far more efficient than his predecessors. Beria has one talent Stalin truly values. He kills quietly, but even absolute rulers need new enemies. With domestic dissent wiped clean, Stalin's gaze turns outward. Europe is on the brink. Hitler has reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, swallowed Czechoslovakia, and now eyes Poland. Western diplomats beg Stalin to join an anti-fascist alliance, but he's no idealist. He remembers how Britain and France once delayed opening a front against Germany during the First World War. They will fight to the last Russian, he mutters to Beria. So in August 1939, Stalin signs a pact with the devil he claims to despise, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. On the surface, it's a simple deal, peace between Germany and the USSR. But hidden inside is a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe like spoils of war. Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, all mapped out with red pencils on the same kind of document Stalin once used for purge lists. You can almost picture the scene. The Kremlin, Late at night, ashtrays overflowing, maps spread across the table. Stalin, in his rumpled tunic, smirks as he clinks glasses with the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. "Let the imperialists kill each other," he says. The interpreter, nervous, translates it word for word. Everyone laughs, except the walls. A quirky tidbit: Stalin reportedly insisted that Ribbentrop stay for vodka after the signing. The German diplomat, a stiff Prussian by temperament, nearly collapsed from the drinking games. Stalin, by contrast, was stone-cold sober by the end. One observer later said, "He drank like a man to whom the world already belonged." When the pact is announced, the world is stunned. Communists and fascists, bitter ideological enemies, are now partners. Trotsky, still in exile in Mexico, calls it the most cynical betrayal in modern history. Stalin shrugs off the outrage. To him, morality is a luxury for those without borders to defend. "We are not romantics," he tells his inner circle. "We are engineers of power." Historians still argue about his motives. Some say Stalin sought to buy time to rebuild his army after the purges. Others believe he hoped Germany and the West would destroy each other, leaving the USSR to claim the ruins. Whatever the reason, the gamble works for a while. On September 1st, 1939, German tanks roll into Poland. 2 weeks later, Soviet troops march in from the east, as agreed. The country is carved apart in less than a month. You might imagine a soldier standing on a Polish road, bewildered to see Red Army troops shaking hands with the Wehrmacht. The world has gone mad, and Stalin is smiling behind the curtain. At home, propaganda paints the invasion as liberation. The Red Army is said to be rescuing the oppressed workers of Poland. In reality, the NKVD begins arresting Polish officials, intellectuals, priests, anyone who might question Soviet authority. A mainstream fact: between 1939 and 1941, the NKVD deported nearly 1 million Polish citizens from the annexed territories. Tens of thousands were executed. Among the most infamous was the Katyn massacre of 1940, where roughly 22,000 Polish officers were shot in secret. For decades, the USSR denied it, blaming the Nazis. Only in 1990 did Moscow finally admit the truth. And yet, Stalin's power seems to grow with every deceit. He watches Europe burn from a distance, trading raw materials with Hitler while presenting himself as a peacekeeper. His speeches become paradoxical masterpieces, equal parts paranoia and paternal calm. "Comrades," he declares, "we desire only peace, but we must remain vigilant." A fringe historical curiosity. Stalin personally edited these speeches line by line, removing adjectives he deemed too emotional. He wanted his voice to sound steady, rational, almost hypnotic. Fear works best, he knew, when it wears the mask of reason. Inside the Soviet Union, daily life takes on an eerie rhythm of normalcy. The factories hum again, the trains run on time, and yet the shadows haven't left. People still whisper about neighbors who vanished. Children still flinch when someone knocks too loudly. Fear, once extraordinary, has become habit. Then, in 1940, something remarkable happens. Stalin begins letting a few exiled scientists, officers, and engineers return from the camps. The purges have gutted the nation's expertise. Rebuilding it becomes urgent. Survivors are summoned to Moscow, told they've been forgiven by Comrade Stalin. You can almost see them, thin, cautious, still smelling of camp smoke, walking through the capital, wondering if freedom is just another trick. And perhaps it is. The new NKVD under Beria operates differently. Fewer mass shootings, more selective terror. It's control through uncertainty rather than volume. When everyone fears the unknown, Beria tells his aides, we save ammunition. Meanwhile, abroad, Stalin's opportunism continues. The USSR invades Finland in the Winter War of 1939-40, expecting an easy victory. Instead, Finnish ski troops, outnumbered and under-equipped, humiliate the Red Army in the snow. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers die in white forests that swallow sound and hope alike. Stalin, enraged, purges his generals again. Historians still argue whether the purges caused those early military disasters. Most agree they did. The Soviet army, decapitated of experienced leadership, stumbled through chaos. But for Stalin, mistakes are never his fault. They're proof of traitors still hidden. A quirky tidbit from the front. Some Red Army units were so poorly equipped that soldiers painted broomsticks black to mimic rifles during parades. When news of this reached Stalin, he reportedly laughed, not with humor, but disbelief that anyone would admit it. By 1940, Europe is collapsing. France falls, Britain fights alone, and Stalin grows more confident. He annexes the Baltic states and carves out parts of Romania. The USSR reaches its largest territorial size in history. For a brief moment, it looks as if Stalin's paranoia has paid off. But somewhere deep in his mind, a new anxiety stirs. Hitler's armies now sit directly on the Soviet border, and the Nazi leader speaks openly of Lebensraum to the east. Stalin receives reports from spies warning of German plans to invade. He dismisses them. Hitler is not a fool, he says. He won't fight on two fronts. In the evenings, he still holds long dinners with his inner circle: Beria, Molotov, Voroshilov. They eat, drink, and listen to old Georgian songs. Sometimes Stalin recites poetry, but the laughter sounds forced, as if everyone in the room knows that the quiet between toasts is the loudest sound of all. The Great Purge has ended, officially, but the shadow it cast remains. The Soviet people move through life like actors who've forgotten the script but still know the cues. They smile when told to, applaud on command, and dream only in private. And in the distance, beyond the Kremlin walls, beyond the borders of the empire, a storm is gathering again, one that even Stalin's fear might not be able to control. It's the spring of 1941, and Moscow hums with a strange, brittle confidence. The factories run 24 hours a day. The newspapers shout about record harvests, and Stalin himself radiates composure. The purges, the famines, the trials, those are spoken of only in the past tense, as if they belonged to some other lifetime. Yet if you stand quietly on a Moscow street corner, you can feel it. The country is holding its breath. Rumors drift in from the west. German troop trains rolling through Poland. Wehrmacht divisions massing near the frontier. Soviet intelligence stations, especially the one in Berlin, send report after report to the Kremlin. The Germans are preparing to strike, they warn. Stalin waves them away. Disinformation, he mutters. Churchill's tricks. He trusts no one, least of all the British, and cannot imagine that Hitler would risk a two-front war. It's one of history's darkest ironies. The man who saw conspiracies everywhere fails to see the one that's real. Mainstream fact. Between April and June of 1941, Stalin personally dismissed at least 80 intelligence reports warning of German invasion. He even punished some informants for alarmism. When the Soviet frontier troops quietly began digging trenches, he ordered them to stop. Didn't want to provoke Germany. You picture the scene. In the Kremlin's lamp-lit office, Stalin hunched over a map, puffing his pipe, lecturing generals about patience. Hitler is not mad, he insists. He will not attack while Britain still stands. It's the kind of fatal logic that only power can create. The conviction that the world must obey one man's interpretation. On June 22, 1941, at dawn, the first German shells scream across the border. Operation Barbarossa, 3 million troops, thousands of aircraft, a front stretching 1,000 miles. The explosion of war is so vast that even Stalin cannot process it. Reports pour in. Minsk bombed, Kiev burning, bridges collapsing. For nearly 2 days, he says nothing. Witnesses recall him sitting motionless, as if his mind has short-circuited. "You've all been deceiving me," he finally snaps at his generals. "Where is the Red Army? It's everywhere and nowhere. The purges have hollowed it out. Communication lines crumble. Orders contradict themselves. Entire divisions surrender or scatter. The soldiers fight bravely, but leadership is chaos. In the first weeks, the Germans capture or kill nearly 3 million Soviet troops. And yet, even in disaster, Stalin's instinct for control reasserts itself. On July 3rd, he finally addresses the nation by radio, the first time the people have heard his voice since the war began. His tone is calm, almost intimate. Brothers and sisters, our cause is just. The enemy shall be defeated. The words are simple, but to millions listening in darkened apartments, they sound like a lifeline. A quirky tidbit: Stalin reportedly rehearsed that speech a dozen times, testing it on aides until he found the perfect mix of authority and warmth. He even adjusted the microphone so his voice would sound deeper, paternal. Terror alone can't win a war. Sometimes it needs a father's voice. Historians still argue whether Stalin's paralysis in June 1941 cost the Soviet Union millions of lives. Some call it catastrophic indecision. Others see it as human shock from a man used to absolute control. What's certain is that the invasion transforms him. The purge-driven tyrant becomes the wartime commander, the vozhd, the leader of all peoples. Fear turns patriotic. As German troops push toward Moscow, Stalin orders the scorched earth policy: destroy everything that can aid the enemy. Villages burn, factories explode, trains derail themselves. You stand on a country road watching smoke rise into a red sky and realize that the land itself is now a weapon. In October, panic grips Moscow. Government offices evacuate eastward. Rumors swirl that Stalin has fled. Then, suddenly, word spreads. He's still here. He appears on the platform of the Mayakovsky metro station, addressing soldiers and workers. Not one step back. His presence steadies the city like a hand on a trembling shoulder. A mainstream fact: Stalin refused to leave Moscow during the German approach in late 1941, even as bombs fell on the Kremlin. His decision became one of the great propaganda moments of the war. Whether out of courage or stubborn pride, it cemented his image as the unshakable guardian of the nation. Winter arrives, brutal as ever. Temperatures plunge below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines freeze. Soldiers fight with frostbitten fingers. The Red Army finally halts the Germans on the outskirts of Moscow. For the first time, the invincible Wehrmacht retreats. The victory isn't just military, it's psychological. Stalin's gamble to stay has paid off. That night, fireworks burst over the city for the first time since the purges, reflecting off the snow like ghosts set free. You imagine people crying openly, not from fear this time, but from sheer disbelief that survival is possible. Still, the war's cost is beyond comprehension. Cities leveled, villages erased, millions dead. And beneath the patriotic euphoria lies a grim continuity. The same machinery of control, only redirected. The NKVD becomes the Smersh counterintelligence network. Its new task to hunt cowards and deserters. Soldiers who retreat without orders are shot on the spot. Stalin's famous order number, 227, not one step back, makes sure of it. A fringe curiosity: Soviet engineers even designed portable execution wagons, tiny mobile prisons equipped with soundproof walls, so firing squads could operate on the move without attracting attention. Efficiency never sleeps. Despite the brutality, morale hardens. The Soviet people begin to believe in something larger than terror: survival itself. The same discipline that once crushed dissent now fuels endurance. Historians call it the paradox of Stalin's war. The tyranny that broke the nation also welded it into steel. By 1943, the tide turns. The Red Army encircles and annihilates the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, a city that bears Stalin's own name, as if history itself were scripted for him. The battle's ferocity defies imagination. Months of street fighting, snipers perched in ruins, entire blocks changing hands dozens of times. Over 2 million men die. When it ends, Stalin's legend is reborn in fire. He becomes the generalissimo, the master strategist, the man who saved civilization. Western leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt, now court him as an ally. The same dictator who once hid behind secret trials now shares conference tables with democracies. The irony is almost cosmic. A quirky note from the Tehran Conference of 1943. Churchill, after too much brandy, proposed executing 50,000 captured German officers. Stalin, stone-faced, replied, "Why so few?" The table erupted in awkward laughter. No one could tell if he was joking. Historians still debate how much credit Stalin deserves for victory. Some argue the Red Army won in spite of him. Others say only his iron will could have held the nation together. The truth, as always, lies tangled between necessity and cruelty. As the war drags on, Stalin's paranoia returns, sharper than before. He trusts no ally, not even those who helped him triumph. Soviet spies infiltrate Western embassies. The NKVD follows generals returning from the front, just in case success has made them ambitious. The war that united the USSR also sows the seeds of another cycle of suspicion. In 1945, Berlin falls. The red banner flies over the Reichstag. Stalin is hailed as the savior of humanity, the man who crushed fascism. The parades are endless. Columns of tanks, rivers of flowers, choirs singing his name. But behind the smiles, the Purge's ghosts still wander. The camps are fuller than ever. Only their prisoners have changed, from Trotskyites to collaborators. You stand among the cheering crowds in Red Square, the air filled with fireworks and confetti, and wonder how victory can feel so heavy. Stalin raises his glass and says, "The war is won, but the enemy remains." No one asks who he means. Everyone already knows. It's whoever he points at next. And so the Great Purge never truly ends. It simply changes uniforms. The old slogans fade, the portraits are repainted, but the same rule remains carved into every heart. Survival requires obedience. As night falls over a victorious but broken nation, you catch a glimpse of Stalin alone on the Kremlin balcony, staring at the lights of Moscow. For a moment, he looks almost human, an old man with too many ghosts. Then he turns, disappears inside, and the door shuts softly, like history taking a breath before beginning again. The war's thunder fades, but the silence it leaves behind is uneasy. It's 1946, and Moscow smells of coal smoke and celebration. The city that should be exhausted instead hums with ceremony. Banners of victory hang from every building. Portraits of Stalin smile down from every street. You wander through Red Square and see his face everywhere, on coins, stamps, even in school books for children who have never known another name to worship. The guns are silent, but Stalin's empire has only grown stronger. The Soviet Union emerges from World War II as a superpower, stretching from Berlin to Vladivostok. Yet beneath the triumphal brass bands, there's an ache that no anthem can drown. 26 million Soviet citizens are dead, millions more maimed or displaced. Whole towns erased from the map, entire families lost in Siberia or the rubble of Stalingrad. But grief is a private luxury now. In public, you smile for the cameras. Mainstream fact. After the war, Stalin was deified in the USSR. Cities renamed in his honor, songs composed for him, textbooks rewritten to cast him as Lenin's chosen successor. The cult of personality that began before the Purge now reaches godlike scale. Statues rise faster than apartments. His portrait is carried in parades like a religious icon. You might think victory would soften him. It doesn't. It tightens the screws instead. The war has taught Stalin a new lesson, that fear and unity can build miracles. He decides to keep that lesson permanent. The NKVD, reborn as the MGB, spreads its network wider. Former POWs returning from German camps are interrogated as possible traitors. Many are shipped straight from the front to the Gulag. A soldier could fight Hitler for 4 years and still end up accused of contamination by capitalist ideas. A fringe historical curiosity. Soviet intelligence actually kept a special department for reading captured soldiers' German diaries. Anyone who wrote positive remarks about German technology, or worse, German women, was flagged for ideological re-education. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin grows older but no less cunning. He moves slower, speaks less, but every sentence lands like a verdict. His inner circle, Beria, Molotov, Melenkov, learns to interpret his silences as carefully as his orders. If Stalin pauses too long before lighting his pipe, someone's career or life might be over. The reconstruction of the USSR begins in earnest. Cities are rebuilt, factories roar again, and scientists return to laboratories that survived the war by sheer accident. The country seems alive with ambition. The atomic project, new railways, colossal hydroelectric dams. But all of it flows through Stalin's personal approval. He signs off on every blueprint, every headline, every miracle. You stand in line at a bakery in 1947 and overhear whispers. They say the rations will end soon. They say bread will be free again. They say Stalin's working on it. Every rumor becomes prayer. Even hunger feels patriotic when you can blame invisible saboteurs instead of policy. The famine of 1946 to 47 spreads quietly through Ukraine, Moldova, and the Volga region. Bad weather, yes, but also export quotas and confiscations. Stalin refuses to reduce grain shipments abroad. He wants to show the world that socialism thrives. Millions starve while trainloads of wheat leave for Europe. Officially, the famine doesn't exist. Historians still argue whether Stalin knew the true scale. Some claim his aides hid reports, fearing his wrath. Others say he knew perfectly well and considered suffering the price of discipline. Either way, the outcome is the same. More ghosts in a country already crowded with them. A quirky detail. Propaganda posters during that famine still showed smiling peasants holding baskets overflowing with fruit. The contrast was so grotesque that some villagers tore them down at night, only to be arrested for vandalizing state property. At the same time, a new enemy emerges: cosmopolitanism. Stalin, wary of Western influence after the war, begins another ideological campaign. Writers, artists, and scientists with foreign connections are denounced. The great poet Anna Akhmatova is banned from publishing again. Composer Dmitri Shostakovich must write more optimistic music or risk disappearing. In universities, professors are forced to denounce genetics and embrace Lysenkoism, a pseudoscientific doctrine claiming that plants, like people, can be re-educated. You almost want to laugh. Science by decree. But then you remember that dissent isn't funny here. Laboratories close, crops fail, researchers vanish. Ideology, Stalin declares, is more powerful than genes. Mainstream fact. From 1948 to 1953, Stalin's government purged entire scientific disciplines, from genetics to cybernetics, for being bourgeois or Western. The USSR fell years behind global research because of it. And then there's the atomic bomb. The Americans test theirs in 1945, the Soviets in 1949. Stalin congratulates his scientists, but in his mind, nuclear power is just another lever of control. The first explosion at Semipalatinsk isn't televised. Secrecy is strength. Inside Stalin's home, life shrinks into ritual. He eats simply: soups, Georgian wine, dark bread. He invites his lieutenants to long dinners filled with awkward jokes and sudden silences. Sometimes he tells stories about Lenin. Sometimes he drifts into monologues about betrayal. The war may be over, but the Purge's reflex never left him. "Comrades," he warns, "we cannot relax. Enemies have long memories." One quirky domestic habit. Stalin adored Western movies, especially cowboy films. He'd screen them privately, laughing when the villain was outsmarted. They learn quickly, he once said about the Americans, but not enough. Beyond the Kremlin walls, the Soviet bloc hardens. Eastern Europe, liberated by the Red Army, becomes a chain of satellite states. Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany. Local communists are elevated, then purged, then replaced by men who owe everything to Moscow. In Czechoslovakia, leaders who hesitate are thrown out of windows. Literally, in the case of Jan Masaryk. Stalin's blueprint repeats itself perfectly, exported with precision. Historians still debate whether these post-war purges were ideological or just habit. Some say Stalin couldn't stop. Purging had become his way of organizing reality. Others believe he saw Eastern Europe as a laboratory for total control, a second chance to perfect his system without domestic chaos. And still, the paranoia deepens. In 1948, Tito of Yugoslavia dares to defy Moscow. Stalin explodes with fury, calling him that bandit. Tito survives only because he's too far away to arrest. Stalin orders assassins anyway. They fail. Tito later sends him a mocking note. "Stop sending hitmen. If it continues, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send another." Stalin reportedly turned purple with rage. By 1950, the Cold War is official. The Iron Curtain divides the world, and Stalin stands behind it, watching. He funds North Korea's invasion of the South, sparking another global conflict. When the US intervenes, he pulls the strings quietly, using Chinese troops as proxies. Every crisis abroad justifies more vigilance at home. Surrounded by enemies, the newspapers say. Trust Comrade Stalin. A mainstream fact. During the Korean War, Soviet pilots secretly fought US aircraft over the Yalu River, wearing Chinese uniforms. The deception worked so well that it wasn't officially admitted until the 1990s. But the dictator is aging. His hands tremble, his eyes water from illness. He grows more suspicious of his doctors than of his generals. A new whisper starts in the corridors of the Kremlin, the doctor's plot. Jewish physicians are accused of conspiring to poison party leaders. Arrests begin quietly in 1952. Interrogations follow. Some are tortured. A few die before trial. Historians still debate what Stalin intended. Was it the opening of another purge? One final purge before his death? Or just the last flicker of an old paranoia that could no longer find an off switch? A bizarre, darkly humorous tidbit. The official newspaper Pravda published an article warning citizens to avoid foreign-trained doctors. Hospitals emptied overnight. Moscow's medical system nearly collapsed from fear. Through it all, Stalin continues to work late into the night. He reads, edits, and underlines in red pencil, just as he did decades earlier. Only now, the handwriting trembles slightly. His empire is vast, his power unmatched, yet the man himself shrinks, a ghost wrapped in metals. You can feel the air in Moscow change again, heavy with waiting. People don't pray here, not officially, but they do murmur small hopes to themselves. Maybe he'll rest soon. Maybe the next man will be kinder. Somewhere in his private dacha outside Moscow, snow drifts quietly through the pine trees. Stalin sits by a fire, alone, listening to old records, Georgian folk songs, soft and slow. For once, he looks not like a god, but like what he always was, a man who feared everyone, especially himself. The fire in the grate at Kuntsevo dacha snaps once and dies down to embers. It is late February 1953. Outside, the snow has a blue tint under the floodlights, and the guard's breath turns to vapor. Inside, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, 73 years old, Generalissimo, father of nations, supreme survivor, sits in a high-backed chair, his pipe gone out in his hand. His staff hover at the door, afraid to interrupt. He has been in one of his dark moods again, silent, frowning, tapping the ashtray as if it were a metronome. You can feel the mood of the whole country packed into that one room. Exhausted obedience mixed with the hope that maybe, just maybe, the night will end differently this time. For weeks, the doctor's plot has dominated every whisper in Moscow. Official bulletins describe a vast conspiracy by Zionist physicians to murder Soviet leaders. Newspapers print the confessions of terrified doctors, proven traitors who saved thousands of lives before being accused of taking them. The arrests have spread beyond medicine. Writers, scientists, even violinists hauled in for questioning. Everyone waits for the inevitable next decree: deportations. Rumor says Stalin plans to send the entire Jewish population east to protect them from the angry public. The trains are ready. The guards have lists. Historians still argue whether that deportation plan truly existed, or whether it was another myth that terror itself invented. Either way, it feels real enough in 1953. Fear doesn't need confirmation, only anticipation. Inside the dacha, Stalin coughs, spits into a handkerchief, and waves off the servants. He is surrounded by those who fear him most: Beria, Melenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. They drink Georgian wine until dawn, a parody of the old comrade banquets. Stalin makes a few jokes about treachery, his favorite theme, and laughs until he wheezes. At around 4 in the morning, he dismisses them, muttering that he'll sleep late. The guards breathe easier. No one wants to be near him when he drinks. A few hours later, the housekeeper knocks with his breakfast tray. No answer. Another hour passes. Still nothing. Finally, one of the guards opens the door and freezes. Stalin lies on the carpet beside his bed, face turned purple, one arm stretched out as if pointing to something that isn't there. The tea on the nightstand has gone cold. It takes nearly half a day before anyone calls a doctor. The men in the hallway argue. Beria insists Stalin is only sleeping. No one dares to touch him. The paradox is perfect. The man who accused physicians of murder now dies because everyone is too frightened to summon one. Mainstream fact: Stalin suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage on the night of the 1st of March 1953 and remained partially conscious for nearly 2 days before dying on the 5th of March. His guards and ministers delayed medical treatment for more than 12 hours, terrified of making the wrong decision. You picture the scene. The most powerful man in the world lying helpless while his subordinates whisper at the doorway. Somewhere in that stillness, the entire system he built is suddenly exposed. A pyramid balanced on one mortal body. Beria eventually breaks the paralysis. He sends for doctors, the same ones previously denounced in the plot. They arrive trembling, aware that saving Stalin could mean their own death. They check his pulse, his pupils, his breath. They administer injections, massage his chest, whisper diagnoses that no one wants to write down. It's no use. The old man moans once, tries to lift his hand, and falls still again. A quirky, almost absurd tidbit. One nurse later recalled that the radio in the next room was playing a cheerful march while Stalin was dying. Every time the announcer said his name, the attendants flinched, half expecting him to rise and issue orders. News of his illness leaks out in fragments. Crowds gather outside hospitals, some weeping, others simply waiting. Comrade Stalin is gravely ill, says the evening broadcast, a phrase unheard in a generation. For a few hours, the entire Soviet Union holds its breath together. And then, on the 5th of March, the voice on the radio changes tone. Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin has died. The reaction is overwhelming. People collapse in the streets. Soldiers cry openly. Factory sirens wail for an entire day. In Georgia, his birthplace, villagers line the roads with black cloth. Yet beneath the mourning, you sense a quieter emotion spreading like a thaw: relief. The terror had been so total that even grief feels suspiciously light. Historians still debate how much of the mourning was genuine and how much performative habit. The answer, probably, is both. People had learned to love their fear. When it vanished, they missed it. Stalin's funeral is a spectacle unmatched in Soviet history. The coffin lies in the Hall of Columns, surrounded by red banners and wreaths taller than men. Crowds surge to see his face one last time, pressing forward until the guards can't hold them back. Hundreds are crushed to death in the stampede, a grim symmetry for a regime built on suffocation. On the podium stand his heirs, Beria, Malenkov, Molotov, Khrushchev. They eulogize him as the continuer of Lenin's immortal cause. Their voices steady, though their minds are already calculating. Each one knows that whoever controls the next speech controls the state. A fringe curiosity, Nikita Khrushchev later admitted that he deliberately overpraised Stalin in that funeral oration, so no one would suspect he planned to denounce him later. Even in death, flattery remained the safest weapon. When the body is sealed inside Lenin's mausoleum beside his former idol, you imagine a strange conversation between the two embalmed revolutionaries. One whispering ideals, the other smiling coldly at the word mercy. In the weeks that follow, Moscow changes color almost overnight. The portraits come down, the whispers grow bolder. Beria, ever the opportunist, moves fast, freeing a few prisoners, easing censorship, promising reform. For a moment, it seems he might reinvent himself as a human being, but the others see through him. By summer, he's arrested during a Politburo meeting, dragged from the room shouting that he's been loyal. Later that year, he's shot in a basement. The Purge consumes its last executioner. The power struggle that follows is quieter than any before it. No trials, no show confessions, just careful maneuvering behind closed doors. Out of this subdued chaos emerges Nikita Khrushchev, stocky, blunt, loud, the very opposite of Stalin's ghostly precision. Few expect much of him. Fewer realize that he's about to commit political heresy, to speak the truth aloud. Mainstream fact. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech, a 4-hour indictment of Stalin's crimes. It wasn't broadcast, but word spread through whispers and shock. For the first time, the party admitted that terror had been state policy. You can almost hear the gasps in that hall when Khrushchev says the forbidden words. Comrades, Stalin abused power. He committed grave crimes against the party delegates. Look around. Unsure whether this is another test, but the applause comes anyway. Tentative at first, then thunderous. It's as if the country is exhaling after holding its breath for 25 years. The process called de-Stalinization begins. Statues come down, names are changed, textbooks rewritten again. Prisoners trickle out of the camps. Families receive official letters saying their loved ones were rehabilitated posthumously, a bureaucratic apology for being murdered. Some letters arrive decades late. A quirky but touching anecdote. In one Ukrainian town, a widow placed her husband's rehabilitation certificate in a frame beside his photograph. He finally got his promotion, she told her neighbors. Historians still debate Khrushchev's motives. Was it conscience or calculation? Probably both. Condemning Stalin allowed him to distance himself from the blood, but it also gave millions a chance to hope again. The USSR would remain authoritarian, but the temperature of fear dropped a few degrees. And after so many winters, that felt like spring. Outside the Soviet Union, the world reevaluates the monster they had once called an ally. Western journalists print stories about the gulags, the purges, the famines. The myth of the wise Uncle Joe evaporates. Yet Stalin's shadow lingers. His body still lies beside Lenin in the mausoleum until 1961, when Khrushchev quietly orders it removed. At night, without ceremony, workers carry the coffin to a simple grave behind the Kremlin wall. No speeches, no parades, just the scrape of shovels and the closing of an era. Even then, Stalin refuses to vanish completely. His portrait remains in homes, his quotes in school books, his ghost in the jokes people tell when they think no one is listening. "He's gone," one old man says in a cafe, but the queue for his permission is still there. Everyone laughs, quietly. And you, standing in that long historical shadow, can't help but wonder whether he truly died that March morning or simply moved inside the hearts of those who learned to fear him. The Great Purge ended 2 decades earlier, yet its rhythm still echoes. Accusation, confession, applause, silence. The snow at Kuntsevo melts at last, revealing footprints that lead nowhere. In the distance, a lark sings above the pines. For the first time in half a century, the sound carries without echo. The dictator is gone, but the country he made is still learning how to breathe. You wake again in the mid-1950s, under a paler sun. Moscow no longer whispers quite the way it used to. The loudspeakers still blare the morning marches. The portraits of Lenin still hang in factories. But something invisible has loosened in the air, like a window cracked open after decades of smoke. The man who terrified the world has been buried, and the Soviet Union is trying to learn a new word: thaw. Nikita Khrushchev, with his round head and farmer's humor, strides into the void Stalin left behind. He laughs in public. He hugs workers. He gives speeches so spontaneous that stenographers can barely keep up. To you, after years of marble solemnity, it feels almost indecent. This man who tells jokes about tractors instead of purges. And yet, behind the clownish grin lies something bold. An attempt to cleanse a nation's conscience without shattering it. A mainstream fact. Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign was the first sustained effort to roll back the dictator's cult. Between 1953 and 1961, roughly 1 million political prisoners were released from the Gulag system, and more than 700 towns and streets bearing Stalin's name were quietly renamed. But undoing fear is not as simple as unlocking doors. The freed prisoners step off the trains thin and bewildered, blinking at sunlight they barely remember. Their homes are gone, their families scattered, their identities erased from official records. Some return to their villages only to find strangers living in their old rooms. Others, too broken to start again, drift into anonymity. Rehabilitation may clear your name, but it can't resurrect your life. You picture a man named Sergei, once a school teacher, now 55, released after 20 years in Vorkuta. He stands in line for bread beside a young woman who wasn't yet born when he was arrested. "For what were you imprisoned?" she asks. He shrugs. "For a comma." She thinks he's joking. He isn't. A quirky, painfully real detail. Official censors under Stalin often treated punctuation as political. One misplaced comma could change "Glory to Stalin, builder of peace" into "Glory to Stalin, builder of peace?" A question mark too many. The camps were full of grammatical martyrs. Khrushchev, for all his bluster, knows the ghosts aren't gone. In 1956, he orders the secret speech printed in limited copies for internal use. The reading sessions are surreal. Party members gather in guarded rooms to hear Stalin's crimes listed aloud for the first time. Some faint, others weep. A few walk out, muttering that it's all a capitalist lie. The conditioning runs deep. When you've lived your whole life in fear of a man's photograph, hearing he was human feels like heresy. Historians still argue whether Khrushchev wanted justice or just stability. His reforms are cautious, reversible. The KGB, renamed again, remains powerful. The Gulag doesn't disappear overnight, it merely shrinks. And yet, in small ways, the ice really is melting. People tell jokes again, quietly at first, then louder. Newspapers begin to print short stories that just hint at tragedy. A popular joke from 1957. "Comrade, what will happen if Stalin rises from the grave? He'll die again, of shame at the queues." The laughter is nervous, but it's laughter nonetheless. Art and literature, long buried under censorship, start breathing again. A young writer named Alexander Solzhenitsyn publishes a novella about a single day in a labor camp. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's small, quiet, unsentimental, and it detonates like a bomb. For the first time, the Soviet press admits that camps existed at all. The reading public, starved for honesty, devours it. Students copy the text by hand, passing it like contraband scripture. Mainstream fact. Khrushchev personally approved Solzhenitsyn's publication in 1962, seeing it as proof that Leninist humanism had returned. But the tolerance wouldn't last. Later leaders banned the author again. The thaw was never meant to become spring. Still, for a few brief years, the Soviet Union feels almost normal. Cafes fill with jazz, painters experiment with abstract shapes, couples stroll through Gorky Park without watching over their shoulders. You sit on a bench and realize how extraordinary ordinary life can feel when you've survived tyranny. Yet even as people breathe easier, Stalin's shadow stretches across the decades. Old loyalists grumble that Khrushchev is betraying the revolution. In provincial towns, party secretaries quietly keep their portraits of Stalin hanging in back offices. They claim it's out of respect, but really, it's insurance. The future is uncertain. You never know which direction the portraits might turn again. A fringe curiosity. Polls taken decades later found that some citizens genuinely remembered Stalin as strict but fair. Memory in a dictatorship is not about facts. It's about which stories kept you alive. Abroad, the myth mutates differently. Western leftists who once idealized Stalin's USSR now face uncomfortable reckoning. Intellectuals in Paris and New York write essays with titles like The Tragedy of the Revolution. Some refuse to believe Khrushchev's revelations. Others confess to feeling politically orphaned. Even disbelief, you realize, is a kind of nostalgia. The global stage changes too. Khrushchev bangs his shoe at the United Nations, shouts about burying capitalism, and still invokes Lenin's dream, but he avoids Stalin's name entirely. The Soviet Union wants to appear reformed, humane, progressive. It sends satellites into orbit, ballets abroad, and smiles to the cameras. The same state that once perfected terror now sells utopia again, polished and modern. A quirky historical footnote. Soviet filmmakers in the 1960s were forbidden to show villainous bureaucrats in gray suits. They resembled the real ones too closely, so every villain wore either medieval armor or a foreign uniform. History was safer when it happened elsewhere. By the late 1960s, Khrushchev himself is gone, quietly ousted, not executed. His successors, Brezhnev and the cautious technocrats, freeze the thaw halfway. Stalin's image remains tarnished, yet untouchable. Schoolbooks still call him a great organizer. Monuments remain standing, though flowers vanish from their bases. The official line settles into a delicate balance. Stalin made mistakes, yes, but he also built socialism. The ghosts are acknowledged, then politely filed away. Historians call this era the time of selective forgetting. People begin to speak of the terror as though it were weather, something that happened, not something done. There was a storm, they say. We all got wet. In homes across the USSR, a new ritual appears. Families gather for tea, lower their voices, and tell the truth in private. Grandparents describe the knock at the door, the interrogations, the years of exile. Children listen wide-eyed, torn between pride and pity. For the first time, memory becomes rebellion. And then, slowly, the stories leak outward. In the 1970s and 1980s, dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, Nadezhda Mandelstam, and Solzhenitsyn again carry the message to the world. The Purge wasn't an accident. It was the system. The West listens, horrified yet fascinated. The myth of the good Tsar, Stalin, crumbles for good. Mainstream fact. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, the Soviet leadership officially acknowledges the purges as crimes against humanity. The archives begin to open. Historians count the dead not as abstractions, but as names, millions of them. You read those names printed in black ink on long, endless lists. Tailors, clerks, soldiers, poets, engineers. Each one once feared silence. Now silence is what protects their memory. The government erects small memorials, but the real monuments are the stories whispered at kitchen tables, the faded photographs retrieved from drawers, the hands that still tremble when someone knocks too loudly. A quirky, tender image. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, an old woman in Volgograd pins her father's photograph to the outside of her coat and walks down the street. "He can come home now," she tells the reporters. Historians still debate why Stalin endures, why his face still appears on posters or coffee mugs, why Poles decades later still show admiration for him. Maybe it's because the terror worked too well. It built not just fear, but faith in fear. Or maybe people prefer a cruel certainty to the chaos that followed. At least under Stalin, they say, we knew who we were afraid of. You lean back, close your eyes, and think about the beginning. About the young revolutionary with steel eyes who turned bureaucracy into a throne. You trace the line from Lenin's funeral to the frozen plains of the Gulag, from Kirov's gunshot to the red banner over Berlin, from the secret trials to the secret speech. It's all one unbroken thread, knotted with blood and belief. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize that the true legacy of the Great Purge isn't the deaths themselves. It's the habit of obedience it carved into the nation's bones, a reflex so deep that even freedom feels dangerous. Stalin's body is gone, but the pause before speaking, the careful glance over one's shoulder, that lingers, generation after generation. The lights of Moscow shimmer outside the window like distant candles for the unburied. Somewhere, a radio plays a waltz from long ago. The song is older than fear, older than ideology. It drifts through the night softly, almost tenderly, as if the city itself is trying to remember what peace once sounded like. You drift forward through time again, the calendar pages fluttering like birds, landing now in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union is creaking under its own weight, its economy stagnant, its factories ancient, its people tired of pretending. Yet it's also a time of revelation. For the first time in living memory, the truth begins to crawl out of the shadows. The word glasnost, openness, circulates like oxygen in a house long sealed. You walk through Moscow on a damp April morning in 1988 and see something you never thought possible. A newspaper article printing the word purge without euphemism. An essay quoting the letters of prisoners from the 1930s. The names of the dead appear in black ink, line after line. Some readers cry. Others stare blankly, lips moving as if counting the uncountable. Mainstream fact. Under Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, archives of the NKVD and later KGB were partly opened. Tens of thousands of rehabilitation requests were processed, and state television aired documentaries about the Gulag. Memorial organizations were founded by survivors and historians to preserve records of the Great Terror. For decades, the purges were a rumor whispered in kitchens. Now, they become a public reckoning. Survivors who once feared to speak queue outside television studios to tell their stories. One woman, small and gray-haired, holds a faded photograph of her husband, executed in 1938. "They told me he confessed," she says into the microphone, voice trembling. "He never confessed to me." The audience is silent. Even the cameraman lowers his eyes. You feel the city itself waking from amnesia. Streets, once named for Stalin's lieutenants, are renamed for their victims. Statues of the dictator are quietly dismantled, some toppled by cranes, others chipped apart by hand. Yet each fallen monument leaves a crater of emotion. For older generations, Stalin isn't just terror. He's memory, victory, the man who survived when no one else did. Historians still argue why this contradiction endures. Was it propaganda, nostalgia, or just exhaustion? Probably all three. Trauma doesn't vanish when exposed to light. It simply changes shape. A quirky fact: when a Stalin statue was removed from a provincial town in 1989, workers refused to destroy it. Instead, they buried it under a tarpaulin behind the municipal theater, in case we need him again. Years later, someone planted flowers on the mound. No one could agree whether it was an act of reverence or apology. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses, not with a bang, but with a series of sighs. The hammer and sickle flag is lowered from the Kremlin, and suddenly there's no one left to fear, only bills to pay and borders to redraw. For a while, it seems the ghosts might finally rest. The newly independent Russia erects memorial stones for the victims of repression. Schools begin to teach about the purges openly. In Moscow, at Lubyanka Square, the old NKVD headquarters, a massive stone from the Solovki camp is placed as a monument. People lay carnations at its base every October. A mainstream fact: the Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Political Repressions was officially established in 1991. On that day, citizens read aloud the names of those executed during Stalin's terror. Each name is a resurrection, spoken into the cold autumn air. But memory, like politics, is never simple. By the late 1990s, the mood begins to shift again. Economic chaos, crime, and humiliation follow the Soviet collapse. For many, democracy feels less like liberation and more like abandonment. Amid that disillusionment, Stalin's ghost begins to look different. Less like a monster, more like a stern grandfather who kept order. You overhear conversations on buses. He was cruel, yes, but at least we were strong. Back then, we feared the government. Now, we fear the streets. The logic is chillingly familiar. Stability, not freedom, becomes the highest virtue. A quirky observation: souvenir stalls near Red Square start selling small Stalin busts again in the 2000s, next to icons of Lenin and Orthodox saints. Tourists buy them ironically. Pensioners buy them sincerely. Time blurs intention. Historians still debate how post-Soviet Russia reinterpreted Stalin. Was it a symptom of nostalgia or national insecurity? The state narrative changes tone, acknowledging tragedies, yes, but reasserting his achievements: industrialization, victory in World War II, superpower status. Television documentaries air titles like Stalin, the Effective Manager. The crimes are footnotes. The tanks get the close-ups. Mainstream fact: by the 2010s, surveys conducted by the Levada Center showed that more than half of Russians viewed Stalin positively or with admiration. Official commemorations of victims continued, but school curricula grew softer on his legacy. It's strange, standing in that modern Moscow, with neon billboards and smartphones glowing against the same stone buildings where whispers once lived. The terror feels both ancient and unfinished, like a wound that keeps scarring over but never closes. You wander to the outskirts of the city one evening and find a small museum built on the site of a former NKVD prison. The walls still smell faintly of damp cement. In the cells, faint etchings remain: names, dates, prayers scratched by fingernails. A guide explains that the museum receives few visitors, mostly students on field trips and the occasional foreigner. Russians don't like to dwell on pain, she says softly. We prefer to move forward. Yet memory resists erasure. Every October 29th, citizens gather at the Solovki Stone to read names aloud. Anna Ivanovna, teacher, shot, 1938. Nikolai Petrovich, railway worker, 10 years in camps. The list goes on for hours. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it snows. People hold candles, their breath visible in the cold air. You listen and realize that in a city of millions, silence can still sound like prayer. A fringe historical curiosity. In 2017, volunteers launched Last Address, a project modeled on Germany's Stolpersteine. Small metal plaques are mounted on the buildings where victims lived, each engraved with a name and date of arrest. The initiative spreads quietly, one apartment block at a time. The plaques gleam like raindrops on concrete, tiny acts of defiance against forgetting. Still, not everyone welcomes them. Some homeowners remove the plaques, complaining they bring bad energy. It's easier to forget than to remember that your walls once heard screams. You start to see Stalin everywhere again. Not in marble, but in metaphor. Politicians quote his slogans about discipline. Talk shows discuss strong leadership with a nostalgic smile. Even some young Russians who never knew the Soviet Union adopt his image ironically, printed on t-shirts. They call it vintage. You can't help but feel the circle turning. The same desire for order, the same bargain, security traded for silence. History, it seems, doesn't repeat, it rehearses. Mainstream fact. In 2019, Russian authorities approved a new high school history textbook that describes Stalin's purges as necessary measures in difficult times. Historians and survivors groups protested, but the edition remained in use. The past, once forbidden to mention, now returns as curriculum. You pause before one of the new Stalin murals painted on an apartment block. The face is enormous, serene, the mustache almost cartoonish. A young couple walks past and doesn't even glance up. For them, he's just decoration, an image emptied of meaning, like a brand logo from another era. And yet, for those who remember, the sight still stings. A quirky tidbit: when a journalist asked an elderly survivor what she thought about the new nostalgia for Stalin, she smiled thinly and said, "You can't scare the dead twice." Historians still debate whether Russia will ever fully reckon with the purges. Some think it's impossible. Too many families were both victims and informants. Too many histories overlap. We were all complicit, one scholar writes. That's why forgiveness never comes. It would require everyone to forgive themselves. You imagine the ghosts of the 1930s walking through the modern city, unseen, unthanked, curious at the glass towers that replaced their tenements. They pause at intersections, listening to the hum of traffic where once there were prison trucks. Maybe they recognize something familiar in the rhythm, the same low rumble of power moving beneath everyday life. And you, standing among them, realize that the Great Purge is not just a Soviet tragedy. It's a warning, written in human nature itself. The moment fear becomes virtue, the moment obedience becomes identity, the machinery starts turning again. The snow begins to fall. Somewhere, a street musician plays an old Soviet song on an accordion, the melody both mournful and sweet. People hurry past, collars up, eyes on their phones. History, as always, walks beside them, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to look back. You stand now in the 21st century, looking out over Moscow's skyline of glass and gold. The Kremlin's red stars still gleam, but their light feels different, more commercial than cosmic. Yet beneath the neon and traffic noise, the pulse of history still beats, slow and insistent, like a heart under scar tissue. Stalin has been dead for 70 years, but the conversation about him has never really stopped. It shifts tone, mutates, resurfaces in new forms, part ghost story, part family argument, part national therapy session that never quite finishes. You wander through Red Square on a spring morning. Tourists line up for selfies outside Lenin's mausoleum, unaware or uninterested that Stalin's body once lay beside his. Children lick ice creams under the same Kremlin walls where once the NKVD filed its reports. The air smells of roasted nuts and new asphalt. It's hard to reconcile this cheerful place with the frozen silence of 1937. Yet both realities exist in the same soil. Mainstream fact: Since 1991, Russia has experienced a complex and often contradictory relationship with Stalin's memory. Memorials to his victims coexist with exhibitions praising his leadership. School curriculums oscillate between condemnation and glorification. His image appears on souvenirs, postage stamps, and even election posters in regional towns. For some, Stalin is still the savior who built industry from ruins, the man who turned peasants into engineers and soldiers into heroes. For others, he is a wound that never closed, a symbol of what happens when power becomes a religion. The debate plays out everywhere, on talk shows, in classrooms, on internet forums, half historical, half personal. "My grandfather died in the camps," one commenter writes, "but we wouldn't have beaten Hitler without him," another replies. Both are right, and both are wrong, and neither can quite let go. Historians still argue about the scale of the Great Purge. Some estimate 700,000 executed, others more than 1 million. Millions more imprisoned or exiled. The numbers blur not from uncertainty, but from deliberate destruction. Many records were burned, others doctored. What matters now isn't just how many died, but how many forgot to ask why. You take a train to Perm, to the far edge of the Urals, where one of the last surviving Gulag camps stands preserved as a museum. The barracks creak in the wind. Inside, the wooden bunks look almost tidy, each plank polished by the passage of bodies. The air smells faintly of tar and old snow. A young guide, barely 20, recites the statistics with practiced precision. But when asked if she believes it could happen again, she hesitates. "Not like that," she says. But people still disappear in other ways. A quirky, haunting detail. In one barrack, the prisoners once carved chessboards into the floor, using pebbles for pieces. They played silently, moving without words. The only game in history where losing and winning felt the same. Proof they were still thinking. Outside, birch trees have grown where watchtowers once stood. You can hear birdsong where once there were guards. Nature, indifferent but merciful, has covered the scars. But memory refuses to fade. Each visitor leaves a small offering, a ribbon, a coin, a scribbled note that reads simply, "Forgive us." Back in Moscow, you visit an archive reading room where researchers pore over yellowed NKVD files. They wear gloves not just to protect the paper, but out of reverence. One historian tells you that every document feels like an act of resurrection. "We are exhuming voices," she says. "Every signature, every confession, every stamped shot. These are people trying to speak through ink." Mainstream fact. Since 2015, more than 1 million NKVD documents have been digitized by historians and human rights groups. Yet access remains limited. Many archives are reclassified or closed again under new state secrecy laws. Memory, it seems, is still something that must be managed. At night, you walk past the Lubyanka, the old secret police headquarters. Its facade glows under floodlights, the windows opaque. Across the street, the Solovki stone still stands, rough, gray, unpolished. People have left flowers, candles, photographs. A pair of teenagers stop to take a selfie beside it, then laugh and run off. You can't blame them. They've grown up in a country where fear is history homework, not daily weather. But as you look closer at the stone, you notice a small handwritten note tucked under a candle. "My great-grandfather, Nikolai. I don't know what he did. I just hope he wasn't afraid." A fringe curiosity. Survivors of the Gulag sometimes said the worst punishment wasn't death or hunger, but erasure. The idea that no one would remember their names. The act of writing that note, then, is a kind of rebellion. Remembrance as resurrection. Historians still debate the long-term legacy of Stalin's purges on Russian society. Some trace the modern bureaucracy's cold efficiency back to his reign. Others see its roots in older autocracies. But nearly all agree that the purge created a culture of caution that outlived its author. Even decades later, ordinary citizens hesitate to sign petitions, to complain openly, to trust institutions fully. The reflex of silence is inherited, like an accent. In the arts, though, the silence cracks. Russian filmmakers and writers of the 2000s and 2010s return to Stalin's terror with new honesty. Movies like Burnt by the Sun, The Commissar, and Child 44 explore betrayal and survival not as propaganda, but as trauma. Their audiences cry, but they also argue, must we relive this pain, or is remembering the only way to stay human? A quirky tidbit. At a 2010 film festival, an elderly woman approached the director of a movie about the Gulag and whispered, "Thank you for showing what my mother never told me." Then she handed him a small cloth doll, saying, "This is all she brought back." Meanwhile, politics finds new uses for the past. The narrative of strong leadership becomes fashionable again. Commentators praise Stalin as a complex but effective manager, a man who made Russia great. You can almost hear the old rationalizations resurfacing. Yes, there were mistakes, but look at the results. It's the same melody, only played on modern instruments. Historians still argue whether this nostalgia is genuine belief or collective fatigue. When life feels uncertain, even tyranny can look like comfort. The past, one scholar writes, is the only future we trust. You visit a classroom where teenagers discuss Stalin during a civics lesson. The teacher asks if they think he was good or bad. One boy says, "He was strict, but fair." Another girl says, "He saved us in the war." A third whispers, "My grandmother said he killed our uncle." The room falls quiet. The teacher sighs and says, "History is complicated." You want to interrupt, to tell them that complexity isn't the same as contradiction, that moral fog isn't balance, but you don't. They have to find that clarity themselves. Outside, life carries on. Street vendors sell Stalin mugs next to iPhone chargers. Subway musicians play Soviet anthems remixed with pop beats. Somewhere, a historian files another petition to open an archive. Somewhere else, a bureaucrat stamps "denied." Memory and power continue their slow, endless waltz. You stop at a cafe window and see your reflection in the glass. Behind you, the city glitters. Same skyline, different ghosts. You think of all those who disappeared during the Great Purge, of their last moments, their letters, their hopes that someone would someday remember. And in that reflection, you understand that history isn't something behind you. It's the mirror you're standing in front of. Mainstream fact. As of the 2020s, no full national memorial for the victims of Stalin's terror exists on the scale of Berlin's Holocaust Memorial or Phnom Penh's killing fields. The memory lives instead in fragments, small museums, volunteer projects, and whispered stories. Yet those fragments matter. Each plaque, each letter, each photograph reclaims a little bit of the stolen humanity. A nation built on silence can only heal through sound. The quiet sound of names being spoken, one after another, without fear. It's late now. The streetlights shimmer on puddles left by melting snow. The bells of the Kremlin ring the hour, solemn and slow. You think of a line from a poem written by a survivor named Eugenia Ginsberg. "We survived not because we were strong, but because the world demanded witnesses." You step away from the glass and into the cold air. Somewhere, far beyond the city, the forests of Siberia are whispering again. The wind moving through the pines like the sigh of a sleeping giant. Maybe that's what remembrance really is. Not noise, but breathing. The country exhales at last, and the frost begins to thaw. It's night again, decades later. You sit on a wooden bench near the Moskva River, where the water reflects the city's yellow lights like molten brass. The skyline is taller now, the traffic louder, but the quiet parts of the city, the corners between monuments, still hum with the weight of what's unsaid. Stalin's time has drifted far enough into history that school children treat it like a story, a myth belonging to their grandparents. And yet, even in their laughter, you can hear echoes of the old reflex. Speak carefully. Keep your opinions balanced. Never be the first to raise your hand. History doesn't disappear. It mutates into temperament. You see it in how people hesitate before criticizing those in power, how jokes still carry a whiff of risk, how silence remains a kind of wisdom. That is Stalin's true monument, an instinct carved into generations, polished smooth by fear and habit. Mainstream fact. Psychologists studying post-Soviet societies have documented what they call learned political helplessness, a tendency among citizens to avoid engagement or protest because of a deep-seated belief that power is immutable. They trace its origins directly to the Stalinist period, when survival required passivity, but the pendulum of remembrance keeps swinging. Every few years, a new debate erupts on television or online. Should we judge the past by modern standards? Was Stalin a tyrant or a patriot? The arguments sound rehearsed, like a national ritual that keeps memory alive through repetition. Sometimes the most dangerous forgetfulness isn't silence, it's normalization. You pass a bookstore window and see a new biography of Stalin, thick as a brick. The cover showing him half in shadow, half in light. The subtitle reads, "The Man Who Made the Century." Inside, readers browse it calmly, sipping lattes. The crimes are acknowledged, yes, but neatly packaged, explained, contextualized, softened. You can almost hear the sigh of relief between the lines. It was terrible, but necessary. Historians still debate that word, necessary. It's the most seductive lie of all. Necessary turns victims into statistics and murder into management. It's the word that made people applaud their own persecution. Every regime has its euphemisms, but Stalin perfected the art of making horror sound practical. A quirky detail. In official Soviet documents of the 1930s, execution orders were sometimes labeled as cases of social prophylaxis, cleansing the body of the nation, like medicine. Even the paperwork spoke in metaphors of hygiene. It's no wonder that bureaucrats could sleep at night. They thought they were sanitizing, not killing. You imagine one of them, a mid-level NKVD clerk, sitting at his desk under flickering lamps, rubber stamp in hand, his tea gone cold. He stamps each file, one after another, the ink bleeding into the paper like small shadows. He doesn't think of faces, only quotas. He goes home at dawn, kisses his wife, eats black bread, and never dreams of the people whose names he sealed. Maybe he sleeps well. Maybe he even believes he's helping build a better world. That's the tragedy of systems like Stalin's. Evil doesn't wear horns. It wears routine. A mainstream fact. The Soviet Union's purges relied not only on Stalin's orders, but on the cooperation of millions, informants, interrogators, typists, guards, even neighbors who filed anonymous denunciations. Historians estimate that 1 in 10 citizens participated, directly or indirectly, in the machinery of repression. It's strange to think that a revolution born in the name of equality produced a society where trust itself became treason. Even families turned inward. Children were taught to inform on parents for anti-Soviet speech. One 9-year-old boy, Pavlik Morozov, became a national hero for denouncing his father. His story was turned into songs, plays, and parades. You can almost hear the moral in it. Loyalty to the state outranks love. A fringe curiosity. By the 1970s, some villagers whispered that Pavlik never existed at all, that he was an invention of propaganda, a myth designed to frighten children into obedience. Whether true or not, the message worked. Generations grew up learning that betrayal could be virtuous. You think about how that psychological inheritance shapes people even now. The fear of standing out, the preference for collective anonymity, the instinct to look away. It's not that Russians, or any people, are naturally submissive. It's that history has trained them to survive by blending in. And survival, repeated long enough, becomes culture. A younger historian you meet at a cafe explains it neatly. The Purge didn't just kill people, it rewired society. It replaced empathy with caution. He sips his coffee and adds, "We still live in that code, even if we don't realize it." You glance out the window, watching commuters hurry past, bundled in coats, their faces pale under neon. None of them look frightened, yet something about their pace, the quick, quiet efficiency, feels inherited from those who once queued in the snow outside the Lubyanka. Even freedom here walks briskly, eyes forward. Still, something remarkable is happening beneath that surface. A quiet counter-movement of remembrance. Across Russia, small communities gather to record local histories, to identify mass graves, to mark forgotten sites. Volunteers dig through archives, travel to remote forests, plant crosses where names once vanished. These are not grand gestures, just steady acts of conscience. Mainstream fact. Since the early 2000s, independent organizations such as Memorial have documented over 3 million victims of political repression, compiling personal files, testimonies, and maps of burial grounds. Their work has faced government pressure and periodic closures, yet continues through volunteers and online archives. One of those volunteers, a middle-aged teacher named Irina, tells you that she spends her weekends scanning documents in a damp basement archive. It's not politics, she insists. It's family. Her grandfather disappeared in 1938. She's never found his file, but she keeps looking. Maybe someone else will find mine someday, she says with a small, knowing smile. You realize that remembrance here isn't just about the past, it's insurance for the future. The act of remembering becomes the only guarantee against repetition. Forgetting is the real danger. A quirky tidbit. In Siberia, a group of school children adopted a local memorial site as their community project. They clean the graves, paint the fences, and recite the victims' names each spring. When asked why, one boy said, "Because no one else will." That, you think, might be the truest answer in all of Russian history. But remembrance has enemies. In some regions, new monuments to Stalin appear. Busts funded by local officials or nostalgic veterans groups. Each unveiling sparks protests, then shrugs. People argue online, then move on. The past reasserts itself not through force this time, but fatigue. After all, it's easier to praise the man who won a war than to confront the system that devoured millions. Historians still debate whether such nostalgia represents admiration or despair. It's not love for Stalin, one sociologist explains. It's love for control. People miss the feeling that someone was in charge. In 2025, a journalist writes a column titled "The Return of the Iron Ghost." He notes how authoritarian habits creep back whenever uncertainty rises, how in moments of crisis, citizens instinctively seek a strong hand. It's not ideology, it's muscle memory. You wonder if that's the final victory of the Great Purge, to make obedience feel like safety. As you walk home along the river, the wind picks up, scattering snowflakes like ash. The city's bridges glow red in the distance, the color of both revolution and remembrance. Somewhere, faint music plays, perhaps an old Soviet anthem reworked into an electronic beat. You pause, listening, and realize how perfectly the sound captures the country itself. Past and present layered together, harmony built from dissonance. Mainstream fact. Every Russian generation since Stalin's death has revisited the Purge in its own way, through films, art, literature, and activism. It's become less a historical event than a recurring mirror, reflecting whatever the country fears most about itself. You imagine Stalin's shade walking through the city tonight, pausing by the river to watch his reflection ripple. Would he recognize this place? Its lights, its music, its ambivalence? Perhaps he would smile. After all, fear and admiration were always his twin currencies, and both still circulate. But maybe he would also be confused. For all its contradictions, this is a Russia where people can speak his name without lowering their voices. where archives exist, where children clean the graves of strangers. The control he built has cracked, however faintly, and the air that seeps through carries the scent of memory. You sit a little longer, the cold biting through your coat, and think of a line from Pasternak. History has never known a man so much like every other man. That's the true horror, isn't it? Stalin wasn't a monster born from another world. He was made from the same clay as everyone else. Fearful, ambitious, mortal. The machinery he built was powered by ordinary hands. And that's why remembering matters, because it means refusing to believe that obedience is our natural state. The wind dies down. Across the river, the Kremlin towers glow softly, ancient and eternal. Somewhere beneath those stones lie the documents, the orders, the signatures, and somewhere beyond them, perhaps, the first hint of understanding that the past isn't a chain, it's a map. If you read it carefully enough, maybe you won't get lost again. Dawn creeps over Moscow in shades of pale silver, and you find yourself in a small park near Sretensky Boulevard. The birch trees are bare, their trunks white as old bones, their branches black as ink. A breeze rattles the leaves that never fell from last autumn, the sound soft and dry like paper. Beneath them stands a modest monument, just a slab of granite, carved with the words, "To the victims of political repression." There's no grandeur, no guards, no music, only flowers that someone left at dawn. You watch as a young couple stops to take a photo, then lingers longer than they expected. The woman runs her fingers across the engraved letters. "My great-grandfather," she murmurs. Her partner says nothing, just holds her hand tighter. A few meters away, an old man in a wool cap stares at the stone for a long time, his lips moving silently. When he finally turns away, his face carries both peace and exhaustion, the expression of someone who has spent a lifetime waiting to be heard. This is what remains of Stalin's great purge, you realize. Not the slogans, not the parades, not even the statues, but the act of standing still before a stone, whispering a name, and feeling history whisper back. Mainstream fact. By the 2020s, more than 1,000 memorial sites across Russia mark the purge's victims, ranging from grand museums to anonymous forest clearings. Each year, citizens gather to read names aloud, reclaiming memory one syllable at a time. The stories come in fragments now. Letters found in attics, diaries smuggled from the camps, memoirs written in careful handwriting that trembles at the edges. One prisoner wrote, "We knew they would kill us, but we hoped they would remember us. That was our small victory." For decades, no one read those words. Now they appear in history books, in classrooms, in films. The silence that once protected the regime has turned into its indictment. Still, the nation's relationship with that silence remains uneasy. For every new archive opened, another is sealed. For every historian honored, another is accused of distorting patriotism. The state walks a tightrope between acknowledgement and amnesia, offering mourning in public, but nostalgia in prime time. Historians still argue what this means. Is it cynicism or confusion? Is the country healing or rehearsing? One scholar calls it dual memory, a coexistence of truth and myth, both accepted because each fulfills a need. The truth explains our suffering, she writes, and the myth explains why we endured it. A quirky anecdote. In 2023, a new museum exhibit on Stalin's era used virtual reality headsets to experience life in the 1930s. Visitors could walk through a collective farm and attend a party meeting. When asked why the Gulag wasn't included, the curator shrugged. "That's not immersive, it's uncomfortable." You have to laugh, though it isn't funny. You stroll toward the river, passing a kiosk selling coffee and postcards. One card shows Stalin smiling beside Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta, captioned, "Allies in Victory." Another shows the same smile in black and white under the words, "Never Again." You flip them over. Both are printed by the same publisher. Memory, it seems, has become an industry. But it's also personal. In countless kitchens across Russia, families still tell stories, some proud, some painful. A grandson learns that his beloved grandmother once denounced a neighbor to save her own son. A daughter discovers that her grandfather was an NKVD interrogator, not a victim. Each revelation tears and repairs at once. History, you realize, is not a clean narrative. It's a family argument that never ends. Mainstream fact. In surveys conducted since 2010, a majority of Russians report that their families were affected by political repression in some way, either as victims or as participants. Yet less than a third say they have spoken openly about it with relatives. The silence remains, but it has grown gentler, less from fear, more from fatigue. You stop by a riverside bench and sit. The water moves sluggishly under the bridge, brown and glittering. Somewhere nearby, church bells begin to ring. The sound carries over the roofs like a slow exhalation. It occurs to you that the story of Stalin's Great Purge is not just about cruelty, but about endurance, the ability of human beings to continue despite it. The Soviet Union that emerged from the 1930s was both broken and hardened. It built rockets, symphonies, literature, cities in deserts, all out of the same steel that once forged prison bars. The paradox still haunts modern Russia. The achievements born from suffering, the pride entangled with pain. A fringe curiosity. A Soviet engineer who survived 10 years in the Gulag later designed the ventilation system for the Moscow Metro's grandest station. When asked how he felt about contributing to the regime that imprisoned him, he said, "I built for the people, not the party. The marble doesn't care who gives the orders." You think of that whenever you walk through those tunnels. The chandeliers glowing, the mosaics of soldiers and farmers above. Beauty born of terror. Endurance carved from stone. Maybe that's the lesson Stalin never understood. Power fades, but creation survives. Historians still debate how the Great Purge reshaped the 20th century. Some argue it delayed progress by annihilating intellectuals and generals. Others claim it inadvertently created unity through fear. But the larger truth is simpler. The Purge didn't just change history. It changed how history is remembered. It proved that memory itself can be weaponized, erased, revived, and repurposed. And in that sense, its echo lives wherever people rewrite the past to comfort the present. A quirky, poignant story. In 2019, a theater troupe in Yekaterinburg staged a play entirely from interrogation transcripts of the Moscow trials. Each line was an exact quotation. When the audience realized there was no script, no dramatization, they wept. "It's not acting," one woman whispered afterward. "It's ghosts." Ghosts, yes, but not vengeful ones. The more you listen, the more they sound like reminders. Each one asks the same question. What would you have done? The question has no answer, and that's why it lingers. As you walk back through the waking city, you pass a newsstand where a headline reads, "New debates over Stalin's legacy." You smile, though it's a sad smile. The debate never really ends, because the question isn't about Stalin, it's about ourselves, about how much truth we can bear, how much fear we can justify, how much silence we can tolerate before it becomes complicity. Maybe that's why every generation rediscovers him, like a recurring dream. Because somewhere deep down, we all recognize the temptation to trade conscience for comfort, justice for order. The Purge wasn't born from ideology alone. It was born from the human wish to feel safe at any cost. You turn down a quiet street where snow is beginning to fall. The flakes spin lazily in the lamplight, settling on statues, cars, shoulders. The world is hushed, gentle, forgiving. For a moment, you let yourself imagine that the millions who died in silence can rest now, that their stories, finally told, are enough. Maybe that's naive, but it's the kind of hope that keeps memory alive. Mainstream fact. Each year on October 30th, at the return of the names ceremony in Moscow, citizens read the names of Stalin's victims aloud outside the old Lubyanka building. The readings last more than 12 hours. The youngest participant in 2024 was 6 years old. You picture that child standing on tiptoe before the microphone, stumbling over the unfamiliar names, her voice high and clear in the cold air. Around her, the crowd listens in silence. Teachers, workers, students, pensioners, each one carrying a memory that isn't entirely their own. When she finishes, she looks up, uncertain, and someone squeezes her hand. That simple gesture, the passing of remembrance from one generation to the next, is how history survives the dark. The city lights shimmer across the water. You take a long breath, tasting the cold. The story is over, but the echo isn't. Somewhere, in another century or another country, someone else will study this era, whisper these names, and wonder how such things could have happened. And you hope they'll notice what every survivor eventually learns, that the answer isn't found in ideology or politics or even cruelty. It's found in fear and the courage required to resist it. You close your eyes for a moment. The hum of traffic fades, replaced by a softer sound, the rhythm of pages turning, names spoken, candles flickering. The noise of memory, persistent and alive. And then, as the snow deepens, the world feels strangely still. Not peaceful exactly, but tender. As if history itself is tired of shouting. Now the lights are dim, and the story fades to a whisper. The wind outside moves through the birch trees, brushing against the windows, like the last breath of a long century. You feel it in your chest, the weight of what's been told, the ache of what can never be fully known. But don't let it linger as sorrow, let it settle as understanding. You've walked through a landscape shaped by fear and endurance, through a time when trust was a crime and silence was survival. You've seen how ordinary people can become the machinery of history, and how memory, fragile but stubborn, keeps finding its way back through cracks in the concrete. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine those names, thousands upon thousands, drifting upward like sparks from a fire. They're not calling for revenge. They're calling for remembrance. And remembrance, quiet and steady, is its own kind of mercy. The world outside your window is calmer now. There's no knock at the door, no hidden file with your name on it. You are free to remember, to question, to speak. That, perhaps, is the truest victory over the darkness that once ruled. So take one last deep breath. Let the cold air clear your thoughts. The past can't be changed, but it can be witnessed, and by witnessing, you keep it from happening again. Now, let the noise of history fade into the background hum of night. The river still flows. The stars still turn. Somewhere, even now, someone is reading another name aloud. Sleep well, traveler. You've carried a heavy story tonight.